If you like the story, you can support the author on Patreon. Link is in the description.
Chapter 366, Lowry. You are late it seems, you just missed Grindelwald. Nick said tiredly, causing Dumbledore to have a disoriented look. He came here thinking that he would be fighting Voldemort, but instead all the enemies were gone and apparently Grindelwald was here for some weird reason. So it was quite understandable that he was rather lost at the moment. Nick wasted no time at all explaining what had happened in the brief period that they had been separated, and even supplying Voldemort's wand as proof. So it is truly over with then, I suppose a celebration is in order then. Just amongst those aware of his return though. Dumbledore said with a smile. Before that though I could use a bit of help from Madame Pomfrey to fix my nerves. The evil bastard used the Cruciatus curse on me and fried a few of them. Nick said while showing his twitchy and unsteady hands. As a craftsman, Nick knew the importance of having steady hands and as a result wanted the damage fixed as soon as possible. Dumbledore nodded seriously and Fawkes teleported both of them back to Hogwarts through the special method only phoenixes could. Madame Pomfrey was horrified to learn that Nick had been subjected to the Cruciatus and had him take 4 potions and stay the next 3 days in bed within the hospital wing. Meanwhile, Dumbledore somehow managed to get Nick an Order of Merlin 3rd class medal for bravery and self-sacrifice that made the headlines since he was the youngest person to ever get a medal. The truth of the story was that he was already pretty close to earning a medal with his corporeal ghost's rings, and this last incident with him giving himself up to save the hostages pushed him into truly earning it. Only the Order of the Phoenix members and a few others such as Harry and Nick's friends knew that Voldemort was truly gone though. Once Nick was released from the hospital wing and his nerves had been fully repaired and acclimated to his body, he went to work immediately on creating a ring for Lucas that restored his magic to the way it was before he became a vampire, as well as had a few extra perks attached. It was ironic to Nick that the book he had gotten so long ago from the system on Tamrielic vampires, Immortal Blood, was now very useful to him. See, the book gave details on the abilities of several different clans of vampires from that world, and after spending a few hundred system points he got some extra information as well that solidified the ring enchantment he was going to make in his mind. Obviously no assistant of his should be ordinary, so Nick was going to boost Lucas's vampiric abilities to a frankly scary level. Cold manipulation from the Folkihar clan, mist form from the Kiralth, sun resistance from Lami Bal. These were the abilities he intended to put on the ring, and thus he needed special preparations to get it done. Lucas was less than happy about needing to donate a few liters of blood each day until it equaled all the blood in his body. Nick used this blood to create a very specific type of blood silver that was tied to Lucas's magic deeply. Once he had enough of the metal, Nick destroyed the remaining blood in disgust, as just making this stuff was uncomfortably close to dark magic. Still, next came the tricky part of the enchantment, where he imbued the abilities of the enchantment. He needed to enlist Flitwick's help with this step, as he needed to take a break for each of the abilities he added to the enchantment. Still, the final result was a thing of beauty, as it was a shiny dark red metal ring that looked like a bat flapping its wings, with the wings connected at the tips to make the band. The stats of the ring were really good too, as the ring was mythical grade and hit all the points he was after. Ring, Lowry, Knight Crown. Grade, Mythical. Abilities, Autozizing, Core Flow, Sun Resistance, Cold Manipulation, Mist Form, Bound, Lucas, Growth. Mythical ability, Blessing of the Bat, grants the wearer the ability to transform into a bat at will. Description, a grand creation made to grant great power to a vampire servant. System appraisal, a complex ring that will change history and carve its name in myth, created by an established ring smith. Flitwick was surprised to learn that his old student Lucas had become a vampire during his travels, and thanked Nick for taking him under his wing, even if it was as a servant, as he knew how badly vampires were treated normally. Chapter 367, Making a Deal. Nick had no reason to keep Lucas's employ hidden from any of the professors, as he knew none of them would spread the information around. If anything, after learning that Lucas became a vampire, they would thank him like Flitwick did. Sad as it may be, they simply didn't have the resources needed to make sure every student that passes through their classrooms have a good life. Still, this didn't mean that they didn't hope for the best and occasionally lend some aid if they could. With the ring finished, Nick left for Ravenclaw Island without disguising himself this time. Considering it was daytime still, Nick wasn't surprised to find that Lucas was still in the manor, hidden away in his assigned room. "I have some good news for you," Nick said as he walked into the room. It was rather funny to see the confusion on the man's face for Nick, but he figured he should probably explain what is going on. "You work for me now. What you saw previously was merely a disguise that I created for my trip to Nocturne Alley. My full name is Nicholas Iron Ravenclaw," he said with a small bow. Lucas was dumbfounded at this revelation, and it showed, but his experience as an adventurer showed itself as he recovered quickly. "I never agreed to work for a kid still wet behind the ears, so while I like the flask I'll pass, thanks," he said, clearly thinking Nick was some spoilt rich kid and wanting nothing to do with it. Nick removed the suppressor for his aura and released his magical energy at the same time, and Lucas froze. "Contrary to what you may be thinking, I am not wet behind the ears, nor am I some spoiled child. I have worked very hard for the power I currently hold, and as for my fortune, that comes with its own burdens. Am I clear?" he asked while actively suppressing Lucas. The vampire was shivering in instinctive fear and nodded hurriedly. Elves are very powerful beings, and Nick already had slightly more mana than Lucas did in his body. Add on the weight of how much purer his mana was compared to Lucas, and it was like standing in front of a dragon for the vampire. Resistance was definitely not the first thing that would pop up in a normal person's mind. Nick nodded, satisfied to have gotten this matter settled. "Perhaps you are not aware, thanks to the less than ideal conditions of your life till now, but I am a rather well-known craftsman here in the Isles. For example, I made that flask you enjoy so very much, as well as this ring here," he said while taking the Lowry ring out of the realm. Lucas's gaze immediately locked onto the ring as all of his instincts warred against his reason. His instincts told him to snatch the ring away, while his reason reminded him that Nick was not the innocent weak child he appeared to be. "Once you swear an oath to me, I will not only give you this ring, but I will also teach you my own personal crafting techniques, spells, and even possibly help you increase your own power at an amazing rate," Nick said with a tempting smile, like he was a demon bargaining for a soul. The similarity was also not lost on Lucas as a Muggleborn, but he had to admit that he was very, very tempted. "What are the details of this oath exactly?" Lucas asked while suppressing his instincts that were muddling his mind. "The terms are very simple. First, you are not allowed to share what you learn, hear, or see while you work for me, knowingly or otherwise. Second, you are not allowed to ignore any order I give you knowingly, so long as it is within reason. Finally, you are to truly try your best to learn what I teach you. That's it, simple and clean as promised," Nick explained calmly. Lucas thought about the terms seriously, and he couldn't see any nasty surprises hidden in them, not for lack of trying, mind you. "All right, I can accept those terms, but to be clear, I doubt I will have much talent in regards to crafting," Lucas said honestly. "I didn't decide to take you under me as a servant and assistant because of your talent, but your personality in the face of your terrible situation. When many would have fallen into dark magics and attacking others to survive, you chose the harsher but more pure path of thievery instead. I can't say you didn't have better options, but I know for a fact that they were pretty bad as well," Nick explained honestly. Chapter 368, Hierarchy. With that settled, Nick sealed the deal with an unbreakable oath from Lucas, causing a permanent magical tattoo of a black chain to appear on his wrist. Nick tossed the ring to the vampire after that, and Lucas slipped it on his ring finger before staggering in place as it took effect. "Why am I so tired?" Lucas asked, freaked out while panting heavily. "Because until now all of your mana has been in a single circulatory system, which was your magical circuits or your blood in the case of vampirism. Thanks to that ring, however, your mana core is now supplying your mana to both at the same time, and so you are operating at half your normal magic at the moment. You'll need a few weeks before your reserves grow to accommodate this increased demand for mana in your body. The good news is that thanks to being able to gain mana from your diet, it is only this long rather than the months to years it may have normally taken," Nick said with a smirk. "Aw, damn it, all this sucks and I have to deal with it for several weeks at that." Lucas complained after he stabilized his breathing. It'll get more manageable in time, but for now we should focus on your new bloodline abilities. Nick said with a smirk. Bloodline abilities? Lucas asked, confused. He was Muggleborn after all, and as such had no such things beyond the single one from being turned. Oh yes, I probably should have mentioned it, but since I used your blood as an integral part of the creation of that ring, its powers are by extension tied into your bloodline while you wear it. In simple terms, you can at this moment be considered the progenitor of a whole new kind of vampire. Nick explained with a smirk. Lucas was dumbfounded after hearing this, as he knew precisely what that meant after being a vampire for these last few years. Most vampires were part of the original bloodline that had no special powers to it at all. The progenitors of the other bloodlines were originally wizards who had special powers before they were turned, and as such those they turned inherited those powers. These special single specialty bloodlines were called exceeded noble vampires. The ones running the main clans belonged to this category, or the category even higher than that was simply called the royals. Royal vampires were what happened when exceeded noble vampires turned a wizard with different bloodline abilities already across at minimum 4 different generations. This resulted in a vampire with no less than 5 different bloodline abilities, or a royal as they are called. These titles were unrelated to the ones that a vampire got with age and power, but still had a huge impact in the vampire community. Royal vampires were, as the name might suggest, royalty amongst vampires, and as such held a very large amount of authority. There was at the moment only a single line of royal vampires that had been crowned not very long ago, historically speaking, the Teeps royal line. Created a bit over 500 years ago by none other than Vladimir Teeps himself, the Teeps royals have held dominion over vampire society this entire time. Unfortunately, there was nothing beyond a royal vampire, as after more than 5 abilities are integrated into the bloodline, only 5 will ever manifest in a single vampire. So while in theory the Teeps royal bloodline has nearly 20 abilities, its members only ever show 5 per member. Lucas was lucky in that the woman who turned him was a born exceeded noble that found him attractive and as such wished to possess him. Yes, one could be born a vampire if the parents were both vampires themselves. In these cases, natural-born vampires then have different ways of seeing the world, with the females being picky about their mates. This sadly meant that when they found someone they approved of, they can turn manipulative and cruel to possess their chosen partner. In Lucas's case, he caught the attention of a vampiress and she manipulated him into eventually sleeping with her, at which point she likely took advantage of his clouded mind from the lust of it to have him drink her blood. After that, all that was left was for her to sink her fangs into him and circulate her blood magic using the blood he drank as a medium. At that point she didn't need to hide who or what she was from him. She pretty much was his only real option as far as continuing to live a decently normal life after that, which was the only reason he was cut loose so easily. Eventually his stubborn refusal to join her will be worn down by the harshness of his living conditions, and she will get her prize, and the years it may take mean nothing to her. Chapter 369, Approaching Chaos. That was of course no longer the case, since Nick had basically solved all the problems Lucas would have had at this point and even elevated his position in the world. He would after all be the second person in the world to truly know and understand how to create and enchant things as Nick does. This didn't even begin to include the fact he could be considered a subordinate of House Ravenclaw, and as such, despite being a vampire, was fairly powerful from a political standpoint. That vampiress would undoubtedly notice this drastic shift in Lucas's situation from her spies and be furious. Just because she wouldn't mind waiting a few years for Lucas to crumble under the pressure didn't mean that she wasn't keeping an eye on him, since after all it wouldn't do for him to die or take refuge with some other vampire clan. In fact, Nick was certain that she already knew that Lucas had been taken by a wizard and his house elf, and was likely trying to figure out who that wizard was. Joke's on them for not realizing that it was a disguise. Nick thought in amusement. There was honestly no way to connect that form with Nick, as the only outlier was Dottie, and distinguishing one house elf from another was stupid difficult. By normal standards they were ugly creatures with wrinkled skin and huge ears that were all as thin as twigs. They also very rarely were born with easily identifiable features that set them apart from the rest, and it was only in the small details that they could be told apart. Dottie, for example, had a set of wrinkles on its face that were unique, which let Nick identify them. So what sort of bloodline abilities do I have now other than that one I already had? Lucas asked curiously. You can turn into mist, control cold to a degree, walk about in the sun freely and turn into a bat. Out of curiosity, what was your original ability? Nick asked after listing the new abilities. I could breathe underwater. It wasn't even all that useful either since I suck at swimming. Lucas said honestly. A mundane ability to be sure, but an ability nonetheless. Nick said, nodding in understanding. So I can just go for a walk without all this extra fabric and not have to worry about my skin getting covered in blisters in 5 minutes? Lucas asked, double-checking. In theory that is what it should do, yes. Nick said with a nod. Then you'll have to excuse me for a moment. I have missed feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin dearly over these last few years. Lucas said, and hurriedly removed his thick coat and hood before walking out of his room and into the hallway of the manor. The sun was starting to fall, but there was still plenty of light coming through the windows, so he tentatively held out his hand, half expecting pain, but all he felt was warmth as the sunlight touched his hand. He didn't tear up or anything dramatic like that, but smiled widely before stepping into the light with a comfortable sigh. Nick didn't interrupt him despite wanting to see the other abilities in action to make sure they were as good as he hoped. He was confident that they wouldn't be disappointing at all, but wasn't a big fan of making guesses about stuff like this. Lucas eventually got enough of just standing in the sunlight and remembered that Nick was still there. Sorry about that, we still needed to go over the other abilities, right? He asked with an awkward smile. Cold manipulation, mist form, and bat transformation to be specific. Nick reminded, and Lucas nodded. Cold manipulation was horribly mana exhaustive apparently, as Lucas barely tapped into it before his mana reserves plummeted sharply. Mist form was actually horribly broken in Nick's opinion, as Lucas could change specific parts of his body into mist and was nearly unaffected by both physical attacks as well as most spells. It did have a weakness in the form of dispersal, however, as using magic to kick up a gale scattered the mist temporarily. The bat transformation cost a chunk of mana and turned Lucas into a small crimson-furred bat. Time passed by after that as Nick held off on teaching Lucas any crafting, but assigned him several books on just pure theory and basics of smithing to study. News arrived verifying what Grindelwald said about him leaving Europe as a town in Africa was sacrificed. By my calculations, I should have roughly 2 years before he starts the reset, and then a few after that until Zeus shows up with Hephaestus and Hestia, so after I graduate is when I need to start keeping an eye out for the gods. Nick thought seriously. Chapter 370, Breakthrough. Nick pretty much left Lucas be for the next month, save the occasional check-in to make sure the vampire wasn't having any issues memorizing the information. During this time period he had greatly familiarized himself with the enchantment for the rings of protection. To the point in fact that he could lightly tap a ring once and complete the enchanting process with only a small amount of his energy lost to power the enchantment. This had caused his daily total to skyrocket from 240 to nearly 500 every day. If his previously made rings were taken into account, Nick estimated that he would only need about a year to meet the bare minimum required for completing the mission. Unfortunately, he knew that this was the absolute fastest he could create the rings, as he was now being held back by his energy reserves. Thankfully, he expected that this problem would be soon rectified during the approaching ritual. With that out of the way, Nick had turned his attention primarily to his studies with great effects. He finished all the 5th year spell work and was now starting on the 6th year. This wasn't to say that he wasn't much more skilled than a student starting the 6th year, as unlike most, Nick didn't forget the previous year's information to focus on the new stuff. The sad fact was that the Hogwarts curriculum was perfectly designed to create powerful skilled wizards, but the catch was that for it to work the students must remember and practice the older knowledge on top of the new stuff. It was like building a tower where the stuff put down was the foundation or base that the rest was built on. By forgetting that stuff, the foundation rotted, thus limiting the height the tower could be built to via conventional methods. Nick, however, focused on keeping his foundation fresh and strong, thus making him better than those with a rotting foundation. The only person in his age group even close to him in terms of foundation was Hermione, as she had an insatiable thirst for knowledge and studied both higher year knowledge but even topics simply not taught in the classes. This led her to be absolutely flexible in what she could do per situation she found herself in. The only thing that irritated Nick about her was that she never fully devoted herself to a single subject once she felt she had a good grasp of the basics of it. On the last day of January though, something changes for Nick that was a momentous occasion. He finally figured out how to put a weak version of any kind of enchantment on an organic material using the Celebrimber style. While this excited him, it also frustrated him to no end, as it was honestly a simply thing he had not thought of until now. See, until this point he had been thinking of the enchantment as a foreign thing, and as a result the magic was rejected even if the enchantment was compatible with the material. It was only thanks to a moment of inspiration as he watched Ron eat a sandwich that he figured it out. The ingredients in the sandwich were also not a part of the sandwich originally, but yet worked together to improve the sandwich when brought together. He thus changed his thinking when adding the enchantment and discovered that it barely worked to allow him to place any enchantment he wanted that was weak on any organic material. With this I am one step closer to enchanting my wand with this style of enchantment as well as the one that makes it work at the moment. Nick thought with a smile. He then focused his attention on improving the strength of the enchantments he could place on organic materials, since he wanted to bring it up to his current standard with metal. Just like before, however, this was very slow going and he knew it would take a long time or a moment of inspiration to make another breakthrough in this. Celebrimber himself was of no help in any regard for the organic smithing experiments, as he was learning the subject at the same time Nick was. Nick was a worthy successor as far as the old elf was concerned, as not only did he reach his own level of skill but had even expanded the style a step forward in a new direction. An interesting thing that had happened was that Steve had lost a considerable amount of weight thanks to Nick regularly slipping him some of the workout potion. The little thief was by no means muscular or anything, but had returned to the regular weight and health of his species, which was a relief for Nick. Chapter 371, 1 month. It wasn't all that hard to get Steve healthy again, as the stubborn critter was easy to trick into exercising. All Nick had to do was transfigure an uncatchable ball from the twins into gold and then release it in front of the Niffler. It was shocking just how motivated a Niffler can be when the prospect of loot existed. The twins had already perfected the ball, so the only way to get it after it was released was the deactivation spell. Steve looked half dead by the time Nick retrieved the ball from chasing it all over the workshop. Nick spent all of February working on improving his ability to enchant organic materials, and he had made a very small amount of progress. Like before, he was still dealing with a heavy amount of rejection from the materials that he needed to iron out. On a different note, his progress with the 6th year books was going well, as he had already memorized the books and was now on the step of practicing the material to integrate it smoothly. While that was going on, he made sure to exert his mana to exhaustion every day so it grew faster. He only had until he was 17 before his mana stopped growing at the rate it was currently, and he wanted to get the most of this benefit while he could. At the moment he was at roughly the level of someone who rarely practiced magic after graduation for a couple years. By his estimation, he should reach tier 2 in mana levels after he undergoes the ritual in 2 more months. In addition to that, his birthday was coming up, and unlike last year, his friends weren't going to allow him to ignore it this year. Thankfully, Ron's birthday was merely a day apart from Nick's, so they couldn't go all out like they wanted to, since that would be unfair for one of them. Other than that though, it was all business as usual for Nick, though he was planning on collecting the star metal his items had accumulated until now, since it should be way more than he needed for the Atronach forge. Nick was sure that there was no thing as having too much metal to work with, but he needed to increase the size of the realm to store it all. Dumbledore had been helping with this by supplying spatial magic items that were eaten by the realm to grow in size. The planet hadn't really grown, but the empty space around that had been expanded considerable, to the point Nick was sure he could fit a small mountain in the ring. His plan for expanding the planet though was very simple, as he started to make regular trips into the Forbidden Forest. The random hills and dead trees in the forest were eaten by his realm and broken down into base materials like carbon, silica, and calcium that built up his planet chunk by chunk. Besides confusing the hell out of the centaurs and magical creatures who saw the aftermath of this land grabbing, the forest itself wasn't harmed at all. Nazgul had apparently figured out that she could control her size to a degree as well during the past month, which let her return to the size of a large dog. Her true size was still increasing, however, as the souls of the acromantulas she was eating regularly were a dense fuel for her and powered her growth. Her purgatory flames were also getting more powerful as the quality of the fuel had increased from her new diet. Nick had already swapped the previous seed in the furnace for this better quality version. Still, it didn't change the fact that Nazgul's true size was now the length of 2 large horses minus her tail, and slightly taller as well. A unique benefit of this large size was that she could be ridden now, which was surprisingly comfortable. Her feathers were soft, and thanks to the horns on her head it was nearly impossible to feel the wind pressure. On an unrelated note, Lucas had finally finished memorizing the books Nick had given him and was ready to start learning the more hands-on stuff. Nick had to take a week to explain the different kinds of metals as well as their properties, both magical and mundane. He set up a small sample of each of the metals he had on hand so that Lucas had something tangible to help remember all this information. Beyond that, though, Nick spent the entire month uneventfully until his birthday came around on March 2, just after Ron's birthday. Ron got gifts from everyone in the form of candy or gag gifts that he took in stride with a happy smile. Chapter 372, Birthday. Nick woke up as per usual on his birthday and cleaned up before sitting in the common room and working on his arithmancy calculations for the changes of the Animagi ritual. He had made pretty good progress in his opinion, as he was already on his 85th attempt at getting a success from his predictions. The previous 84 attempts had ended in decreasingly catastrophic failures that turned him into something closer to a werewolf than a magical animagus. Still, he was getting closer and closer to succeeding, at which point he can get an outside opinion on his calculations to see if they are correct. The first of his friends down from the dorms was as usual Hermione. "Happy birthday, Nick," she said with a bright smile after seeing him. "I keep telling you guys that it's not a big deal, it's just another day for me," Nick said with a sigh. "Hogwash. It's your birthday and that is always going to be a big deal. At the rate you are going, it might give and be made a wizarding holiday," she said with a joke at the end. "Ugh. Don't even joke about something like that, I think I'd die of embarrassment every year if that happened." Nick shuddered at the idea. He was a rather private person, so the thought of the entire world celebrating his birthday gave him unpleasant chills. "You will have done it to yourself. Honestly, how many mad miracles do you have just floating around in that head of yours?" Hermione asked enviously. "More than I should, but less than you'd think," Nick said cryptically. Hermione merely rolled her eyes at that answer, since it was the sort of vague answer he usually gave when he didn't want to answer. About an hour later, Ron and Harry came trudging down the stairs to the boys' dorm, and Nick shook his head at how tired Ron looked. To be fair though, Ron wasn't a morning person, so he couldn't exactly be blamed for it. "Happy birthday, Nick," Harry greeted with a smile what he said. Ron said with a wide yawn. "Since everyone is up, let's head over to the Great Hall and grab some breakfast before you all need to go to class," Nick said while storing away his notebook covered in numbers and symbols. They met up with Luna, Daphne, and Tracy on the way to the Great Hall, and Nick was once again wished a happy birthday. Breakfast was a simple affair with the standard protein-rich foods that the people in England love in the mornings. Nazgul was unfortunately not allowed to partake, as given her true size she would clear off the entire Gryffindor table and then ask for seconds. Nick still gave her a taste of the foods she wanted, but those were mostly just snacks to keep her happy. He promised to eventually figure out how to make a version of Lemba's bread that tasted like bacon for her, but that was a for later project. Classes started shortly after breakfast, so Nick split with his friends for the next few hours and focused on his calculations during this time. About halfway through this time, Helena floated through the wall. "Decided to skip the door this time, I see," Nick said with a raised eyebrow. "Old habits die hard," Helena said with a shrug before looking over his calculations. "You got this part wrong, it should be a 6. She said while pointing at a 9 in the middle of his work. He cursed to himself when he saw that she was right and proceeded to erase all of the formulas and work after that point, as it had been tainted by that mistake. Mistakes meant a horrible outcome when the changes to the ritual were implemented, so nothing less than perfection would do. Quantifying something was easy as long as it was a static thing, which the magical phenomena was. Thanks to Helena's previous work, Nick also had the quantification of his race already, so all that was left was the actual modification of the ritual. Despite that, it was horribly difficult even with the knowledge he had at the moment, so failing many times was to be expected. Happy birthday, by the way. Do you have all the ingredients for the ritual picked out so far? Helena asked seriously. Nick nodded but didn't share the details of what exactly he was going to use as a sacrifice. Firstly, because it honestly wasn't info she needed to know, and because she might try to convince him to save some of it if he did tell her. Chapter 373, Birthday, 2. To be fair, Nick knew he was probably being more than a little wasteful with the parts he chose to use, but the ritual did specify that the rarity and power of the creature whose parts were used affected how big of a boost he received from the ritual. He wanted the best possible increase in his mana reserves, which was why he was using a unique only one in the world part like the heart of a Daedra. The rest of the parts, while certainly extremely rare, likely had others just the same somewhere in the world. Even the tales of Herpo the Foul never said that his basilisk was dead or killed, merely that it guarded his treasures and accidentally destroyed his Horcrux. For all Nick knew, that ancient magical serpent might still be alive somewhere as an even more powerful ingredient than the 1,000-year-old one he had killed in the chamber. Speaking of the chamber, Nick couldn't help but remember the disappointment that he got from the quest he completed. The two items he got were a book about trolls that was mostly just conjecture and a pair of steel tongs. The points were stockpiled like the rest, and the material was a block of iron of all things. It was infuriating to say the least. Nick shook his head to get rid of that topic, as it just made him angry to think about. The ritual should in theory set me firmly in the next tier as far as mana is concerned, so my control will need to be trained afterwards, but it shouldn't be a huge problem. Nick said, and Helena seemed satisfied with his answer. What about Nazgul? As you're familiar, it is to be expected that the sudden boost may affect her as well through your bond. Helena said seriously. I'm not 100% sure how it will affect her, but I assume that she will merely grow a bit or grow slightly stronger, but the change should be minor either way. Nick said, not particularly worried about it. Why would he, when whatever effect takes hold in Nazgul would be a positive one? The more powerful she was, the better for him, as she will be at his side when he clashed with Zeus in the future. From what he understands of Kronos' warning, Zeus ought to be a tier 7 or possibly 8 being. Nick theorized this based on the myth of how exactly both Kronos and his father were overthrown. Kronos overthrew his father with the help of several other titans, and Zeus in turn overthrew Kronos with the help of other gods. This meant that in a 1-to-1 size up, Kronos should be a tier or 2 behind the tier 9 being that was his father, while Zeus should in theory be the same. According to myth, Zeus hadn't sought greater power after gaining hegemony, so he should be the same tier as he was at that time. Nick got rid of those thoughts though, as he focused on redoing his calculations under Helena's watchful eye. Soon enough though, the time came for his friends to get out from class, and he had to face the horribly corny birthday experience they cooked up. He got candy gifts much like Ron, but unlike Ron he was forced to endure, as his friends and even Flitwick shared memorable moments they had with him. Harry had made a point to expound in great detail the first trip to Diagon Alley they had. Nick was embarrassed about his behavior during that time, as he looked like a shy, scared moron at the time, since he was trying to avoid attention. Harry was a very perceptive person, much to Nick's horror in this case, as his friend shared all of the embarrassing points of the trip. It was even worse in Daphne and Tracy's cases, however, as they pointed out how dangerously close to flirting he had gotten when he first met both of them. Luna naively pointed out how Nick seemed to favor her over all the others, and he blanched. Nick was sure that the others knew that she probably wasn't aware of what she was insinuating, but had no problem at all ribbing him over it. Needless to say, Nick had a wonderful birthday, all things considered. The house elves of Hogwarts also had standing orders to deliver a slice of birthday cake to each person during their birthdays, so he got that too. Interestingly, the elves personalized the cake for each person individually, so the type of cake differed from person to person. Nick, for example, loved sour or tart foods and as a result received a lemon cheesecake with black cherry jam on top of it. Chapter 374, Atronach Forge. After his birthday, Nick waited a few days before heading up into space to retrieve his accumulated harvest. It came as little surprise to him that each of the marbles were now the size of a mansion on average. Unfortunately, most of that size came from the material attached to the star metal rather than the metal itself. After placing each of the massive collections into the realm, Nick fed anything that wasn't valuable to him to the realm to fuel its growth. This was what consisted of the majority of the collected stuff, and in the end left him with roughly enough star metal to create a life-sized horse statue if he wanted to. He also got a decent haul of other rare metals such as tritium and hyper-dense iron ferrite that were mixed in with the star metal. The realm easily separated these metals and left only what Nick wanted. He wasted no time at all melting the metals he was using to create the forge in his furnace and moving the molten metal into the very large molds that he prepared long ago while the next batch of metal was sent into the furnace. It honestly looked like a never-ending flow of bright liquid metal floating through the air and into the molds until they were full. The now complete molds were sent into his realm immediately since he didn't want to have to explain what they were for should anyone see them. Over the next month, Nick carefully carved a small portion of the paragraphs of Daedric runes he needed into the massive rings little by little. He otherwise spent most of his time improving his skill with the school spells or forging rings of protection. His improvement with the school spells had slowed down since the 6th and 7th years materials were the most complicated taught at Hogwarts. The special thing about these classes was that to take them you actually had to have a certain level of grade in that subject. The grade accepted differed from class to class, but the principle was the same. Nick had long since reached the required skill in the subjects, so it wasn't a problem for him to get the materials for self-study from the professors. Most of them were shocked to see how quickly he had mastered the previous year's spells and knowledge after being exempted, but all of them agreed that it was clearly the correct course of action. Hermione tried to bug him into letting her see the high-year textbooks since you needed one of 3 things to get access to them normally. The first was permission from a professor for that subject, which Nick had. The second was an age of 17 or older, as you were a final year student at that point and basically considered an adult. The final option, however, was to acquire the texts via illegal channels. Such channels did in fact include trying to get it from a higher year student or someone who acquired it legally. There was good reason for these restrictions as well, since they prevented anyone without the proper level of skill from attempting them and having to deal with the consequences should they fail. Nick was absolutely certain that for most of these spells and techniques Hermione was not capable of at the moment, and that if she attempted them she may die, that's if she was lucky. So despite her repeated attempts to get access to the texts, she was denied outright. Still, on the last day of the month of March, Nick placed the finishing touches on the Atronach forge ring configuration and quadruple-checked his work for mistakes, but was satisfied to discover none. "Dottie!" he called after leaving the realm. With a pop. His servant appeared eager and ready to serve. "Has Sir called to Dottie about the vampiress situation?" his servant asked curiously. "Not at this particular moment, but if she has made any large moves let me know immediately," Nick answered seriously. He had been having Dottie keep an eye out secretly for the Vapress's movements, as she was likely very unhappy at the moment. "The woman has only been searching for Mr. Lucas so far, Master, but Dottie has noticed an increase in aggression amongst those she has sent to find him," his servant supplied, and he nodded in understanding. "Keep me apprised of the situation. For now, though, I require you to bring me to the manor," Nick commanded, and his house elf eagerly moved to obey. Nick had long since cleared out the torture room of the manor and decided to use it as the location of the forge, since it was far sturdier than most of the manor due to its intended purpose. Chapter 375, Atronach Forge, 2. Nick didn't intend on taking prisoners to torture, so the room was repurposed to house the forge, since the things the forge made might be rather volatile at first. Atronachs were magical constructs and as a result wouldn't try and keep their surroundings intact when they were first born. Nick would need to command the newly created things to restrain themselves before he allowed them out of this room. That was for later, though, as at this moment Nick started to take the individual rings of the forge out of the realm and setting them in place at the center of the room. At first glance the now set up forge looked like several large rings laid within each other by size covered in dense jagged-looking runes. But when Nick tapped his wand on the largest ring that was at the outermost part of the setup and dumped his entire mana reserve into it, this changed. All of the rings began to hum and float into the air while the runes glowed in brilliant blue. Nick noticed that the amount of mana he used was only barely enough to activate the forge but nowhere near enough to use it. This didn't bother him as he had already predicted that this would happen using context clues about the world from which the forge originated. Nirn was a world that was positively drenched in mana to the point magical creatures had been recorded manifesting from thin air, such as was the case with the ice wraiths. Obviously the enchantments and magic of such a place would likely not work with extreme efficiency in mind like this world's magical processes did. Nick had already taken that into mind when he was tweaking the original schematics rune layout for the forge. His version was much more efficient than the original, but even then it was an absolute mana drain of heavy proportions to use the forge. Thankfully he had taken this into account and had Dottie and Lucas placing Daedric rune stones at the edge of the island for the past month. Each rune stone served as a sort of mana collector and focus that will draw in the mana and confine it to the island, raising the mana density massively. The final step of his plan, however, was to place the keystone of this array of rune stones in the center of the manor so that most of the loose mana concentrates there. At the moment the rune stones weren't active, but he didn't doubt at all that once he started to activate them it would create a huge commotion. After all the mana detecting instruments in the world would likely register the massive flow of energy directed at a single location. It would of course stabilize in a short period of time, but Nick still needed to worry about people figuring out where the island was before it did so. He had taken this into account as well and added a delayed activation function of varying times to each of the rune stones. This meant that even though they would all activate the moment the keystone did, it would take a while before each stone began to draw in mana. This delay was just long enough that it would trick all but the most sensitive instruments into not noticing it. For people like Luna that could sense mana in some manner, though, they would notice it flowing in a different direction and probably ignore it. So when Nick activated the keystone in the center of the manor he was relaxed. He had wanted to use his realm for the forge originally, but he had a spark of enlightenment and realized that he was actually more likely to have it discovered there and settled for the island instead. It would take about a month in total for the rune stones to all work fully and saturate the island in mana. In theory this should act as a simulation of what the entire world will experience after Grindelwald is done. Nick expected the island to undergo either evolution or atavism as the plants and animals on it adapt to the mana or revert back to their more powerful ancestral forms. Nick was almost regretful that he didn't have a dragon on the island to see what the atavist form of the creature was. Still, once he had the mana he needed to use the forge, Nick knew he was going to start creating an army of Atronachs for the future. This led him to his next course of action that was rather irritating to deal with: blood binding gems to himself. To ensure that the Atronachs were born unswayably loyal to him, Nick needed to soak the gems he used as their base component while making them in his blood. Chapter 376, Heir Atronach. Blood binding was not a new concept from another world or anything, as this world also used it in several ways as well. The vaults at Gringotts, for example, are bound to a bloodline via this method the first time a new member of the bloodline wants access to them. That was the truth of the inheritance test at Gringotts. Not only was it to determine one's bloodline but also to allow the goblins to make a new key to the vaults. That key was bound to the person who underwent the test. Thanks to this, it was also used to bind certain artifacts to oneself as well as to cast spells of some kinds. Nick would have loved to be able to use natural gems to create his Atronachs, but his wealth was vast, not limitless. He needed hundreds of various types of gems all the size of his pinky nail in order to create the Atronach army. While the gems didn't need to be pure for the magic to still work, purity was a factor in the starting power of the Atronachs. Magically grown gems were less than ideal but better than the horrendous price that natural gems would cost. At the moment Nick only had the few natural gems he had retrieved from the Room of Requirement that had chips or cracks all along them. Thankfully the forge couldn't care less about the flaws of the gems beyond purity and would use them just as well as the others. Nick's best gem though was a diamond the size of an egg that was flawlessly cut and natural to boot. He could use this to create an extremely powerful air Atronach with the forge and had been soaking in his blood since he got it earlier this year. Air Atronachs were rare types of Atronachs on Nirn that, unlike the closely related storm Atronachs, were made of many large tan rocks with swirl patterns that held up their stony bodies. It may even be better to describe wind Atronachs as stone Atronachs instead, but their elemental alignment was purely wind-based, so that was what they were called. The base form of the rock's alignment was similar to a person in that they tended to have a humanoid face, wide torso and 2 arms. Air Atronachs, however, had no legs and floated in the air to move about. The terrifying thing about them, however, was that not only were they born with a sword in each hand that they could use to great and terrible effect, but they could also grow more arms and swords with age and power, up to a maximum of 6 alongside 3 heads. Even more terrifying is that they can eat other Atronachs to gain their elemental powers and alignment. Nick wanted an air Atronach very badly to complete his Thundering Warrior plan. With this diamond and the Atronach forge up and running, he would soon get that opportunity. Still, with him now needing to wait yet another month for the mana concentration to reach acceptable levels on the island, Nick returned to Hogwarts. April proved fairly calm as the Daily Prophet stopped publishing articles on Grindelwald's activities. The real problem came in the form of the professors cramming as much of the year's knowledge into the students' heads for the upcoming exams. For Nick, this involved him needing to drastically slow his own progress to tutor his friends in what they should know. It came as little surprise that he was best at teaching Transfiguration and but even his tutoring on the other subjects was pretty good. He was perhaps not the best of teachers in those other subjects, but he certainly had a better grasp on them than almost any other student in the school. The only thing he struggled with was practical herbology, but he had long since given up any hope in that subject. Sure, he could have made an enchantment that forced the plants to ignore him or something of the sort, but it honestly seemed like a pointless thing to do when he could just have someone else take care of it for him, like Neville, who was a prodigy in herbology. Despite this calm period, however, Nick grew more and more anxious as the end of the month approached, as the date of the ritual was coming up. May 1st, or Beltane if preferred, was bound to be a momentous occasion for Nick, as his mana reserves were going to get a massive boost. He had already set up the ritual circle in the greenhouse of the manor and merely needed to wait for the apportioned time to undergo the ritual. Chapter 377, Ritual of Nature. On the final day of April, Nick went to the island and shuddered as he felt the dense ambient mana in the island's atmosphere. It was like a heavy dome of pure mana sitting over the island, and just being in it filled him with energy and a false sense of omnipotence. This might cause some problems after Grindelwald sets off his ritual, Nick thought with a frown. He could tell that this false sense of power came from the sort of high that came from going from a low ambient mana environment to a dense mana environment. The island was absolutely still at the moment, as only the sound of the wind rustling plants and ocean crashing against the sides of the island were audible. This was because nearly every animal on the island was in a state of hibernation as their bodies changed from the mana. It would have taken far longer for the concentration of mana to reach this level had it not been for the fact that the island sat over a ley line nexus. This allowed the rune stones to have an already powerful source of mana to draw from nearby, lessening the draw from the rest of the world. Nick walked into the manor and marveled at the power he felt flowing through its walls towards the keystone at its center. The keystone itself was surrounded by a glowing cosmos of raw mana that slowly swirled around it like a galaxy. Walking into the greenhouse with Helena, who hadn't been to the island since before he set up the rune stones, he checked the time tempus. He spoke calmly with a swish of his wand. 8:53, I still have roughly 2 more hours before the ritual begins, I should meditate. Nick thought as he set an alarm for 10:30 to stop him from missing the optimal starting time. He doubted he could have missed the start of the annual phenomena anyways, since the massive upsurge of mana would hit him like a truck thanks to his senses. Still, Nick would rather avoid that and turn them off before that happened. Helena was far too busy trying to figure out what was going on with this crazy high mana concentration to bother Nick while he meditated in the center of the complex ritual circle. Brrrrrrr. Soon Nick's wand vibrated as the alarm went off, and Nick brought his mind back to reality and opened his eyes. Already signs of the upsurge were manifesting, that's to the nearly visible mana in the air that was growing restless and excited. Nick stood up from the ground and went into the realm for a moment to get changed and leave his wand, rings and animal product clothes behind while he put on a loose white cotton robe that went down to his ankles. The rules for this ritual were very clear that other than the wizard themselves and the sacrifices absolutely nothing animal-based was to be present in the circle. Nick left the realm after 5 minutes and quickly set each of his sacrifices in their designated spaces before leaving his ring with his realm outside the circle. Hiss! Helena sucked in a breath as she observed each of the sacrifices in shock. She very likely realized the rarity and power of these things and was horrified that he was using them like this. Nick noticed her confusion at the Daedra heart, but he wasn't going to explain that at all. Not that he really could to begin with without revealing the system to her. That was certainly not something that he was ever going to expose to anyone for as long as he lived. Helena didn't get any time to question him about where he got the odd heart from though before Nick shut off his magical senses as the mana in the air receded as a precursor to the tsunami of mana coming. Nick waited with the ritual circle primed for action at the slightest trigger for 5 dreadful minutes before the ground shook and a literal geyser of mana blasted up from the nexus below the island. The circle immediately sprang into action and the first sacrifice turned into dust and vanished, the Lethafold gem. That was the last thing about the ritual Nick remembered as he lost consciousness per the ritual's power. While Nick was out cold, great changes took place within the circle as a vast quantity of mana was pushed into his body. This mana didn't just go into his body though, as the mana within his body already was expelled and dispersed into the atmosphere. This was why this ritual was called the Ritual of Nature. The wizards or witch undergoing it had their body and mana core refined by the world itself. Chapter 378, Ritual of Nature, 2. For most this would be a agonizing and horrible experience as their mana and magical circuits were atrophied or impure, and this ritual cleaned them both out, forcefully. Nick on the other hand had pure mana and all of his mana circuits were sturdy and open from the potion he drank shortly after arriving in this world. The increase in quantity of mana was actually from the sheer pressure of so much mana being forced to such small circuits and mana core, thus rapidly forcing them to expand to accommodate it. Soon the mana that the gem summoned for the ritual vanished, at which time the next part was burnt up, the dragon heart. This time the mana was much lower than the Lethafold gem, but still a powerful amount that continued the previous mana's work. The mana flowed in and out without stop as this was the way the ritual was designed. The phenomena of Beltane lasted a total of 3 hours, starting at exactly 11 the last day of April and ending at 1 o'clock on May 1st. Every 30 minutes the next part was burnt up and the focused flood of mana was forced into and out of Nick until it was time for the next part's mana. 3 hours with 6 bursts of refinement to increase the wizard's connection to the world and power. Helena watched this process from the side and noted that the final part sacrificed, the Daedra heart, also summoned the largest amount of mana out of all of them, with an amount so great that she literally couldn't see Nick from the silvery mana, so dense it was visible. She might not know what it was, but she was clear that whatever it was had been wasted in her opinion. She couldn't blame Nick for it, however, as she had been researching Zeus much like he had since that book was read. What they had figured out about the god was enough to make even wastes like this acceptable if it meant a better chance of surviving and winning for Nick. Still, it clashed with everything she had been taught and learnt about treasures like that and made her uncomfortable as a result. Exactly 3 hours after the phenomena began, it vanished just as quickly and the mana levels on the island dropped back to the point they were at before. Nick woke up shortly after that and was left stunned by what he found. His mana reserve hadn't just increased enough to put him in Tier 2 level, but was nearly at the peak of Tier 2, which placed him next to the likes of Sirius and Lupin in terms of raw mana. It should be stated though that both men were in a situation that didn't not allow much growth in mana for the last decade, so were not yet in Tier 3 but at the precipice of obtaining it. Sirius was in Azkaban while Lupin was living the wretched life of a werewolf and as such couldn't study or perform magic regularly. Just their natural growth from before the Potter's death till now had them sitting at the top of Tier 2. Nick was now just a small step behind them in terms of mana. I may actually be able to reach near Zeus's level by the time I graduate if my passive growth doesn't slow down, he thought while marveling at the pulse and flow of mana in his body. Holding out his hand, Nick conjured a ball of flame that he held above his finger effortlessly. My bloodline abilities also seemed to have gotten a boost, as this would have been a large drain on my mana before, but now I barely even feel it," he thought with a grin. With a wave of his hand, Artemilmi reappeared on his finger and he vanished from the greenhouse. Nick got dressed again and re-equipped his protective gear and wand that hummed as it resensed with his mana. Wands grow with their owners in terms of power, so usually the situation where a wand can't handle its owner's power is rare. Nick's mana was now many times denser and more powerful, so his wand needed a while to adjust. Nick didn't mind this, as all it meant was that he needed to take it easy on spell work until it was done. Much like he had assumed, Nazgul was almost entirely unaffected by the ritual and was more upset about not being asleep than anything else. It should be remembered that it was after 1 at night and they would normally be long asleep by now. "Yeah, you're right, I can worry about everything after we wake up tomorrow," Nick said with a smile while ruffling her feathers under her horns where she likely it. Chapter 379, True Prophecy. He was unusually calm after the ritual, as though a great burden had been lifted from him, and in some ways that was quite true. His newly acquired power may take some training to get his previous level of control over, but would otherwise accelerate his preparations against Zeus greatly. Take his current and only active mission for example. Right now he theorized that with his current amount of mana he should be able to knock out the main objective of forging 250,000 rings of protection in about 3 months. He was already right around a quarter done already, at right around 80,000 rings completed. With nearly quadruple the amount of mana as before the ritual, he could increase the amount of rings he could forge per day by nearly the same amount. Before he was sitting pretty at a little over 500 a day, but that multiplied by 4 was around 2,000 a day. If the math was right, then Nick assumed that around 3 months from now he will be done with the first part of the mission. Specifically in about 85 days according to the math, which he estimated to be around October 25. The reason it would only be done then was that school ended on June 1, so he would be away from his workshop until September at the earliest at that point. Dumbledore had already stretched the Board of Governors' patience thin with the exemption to all classes that Nick had, so there was no chance at all that he could stay at the castle over the summer too. This meant Nick had roughly 30 days to crank out rings at full speed before he has a mandatory 3-month break from it. That's fine, as I will be busy over the break with my new Atronachs, Nick thought the next morning as he was eating breakfast. His friends wouldn't have time to bother with him for most of the month as they had exams to deal with. Each class's exam was spread between the next 4 weeks, forcing all the students to cram when they weren't taking the tests. Nick was going to drop nearly all other activities and studies for the month to work on the rings. On an unrelated note, Harry had indeed struck the final blow against Voldemort, apparently as prophecy dictated. Apparently the man had pulled a fast one on Nick and abandoned his body after getting serious spiritual damage from the arrows and fled to his nearest Horcrux. Apparently the chaos of Nick's attack had allowed the greatly diminished soul to slip through his net and attack Harry. In a hilarious twist, Harry happened to be practicing with his dagger at the time and swung it into the man's soul form accidentally. True prophecies might be vague, but they were damn near ironclad in how they must be fulfilled. Harry was supposed to deal the final blow with a power that Voldemort knew not, and he did exactly that. In canon, that power was the hidden soul shard in Harry's forehead and the Elder Wand's loyalty issues. Either way, Harry was finally free of that damnable prophecy and had even started to heal the scar on his forehead. Nick had checked secretly and was pleased to find that with the main soul of Voldemort's gone, the shard had begun to dissolve into Harry's soul, strengthening it. The problem Nick had, however, was that the words of Chronos weren't true prophecy, in that the Titan had only seen the flow of time in a general sense. True prophecy instead locks the future in place as a very specific outcome to take place. For example, if a seer were to say that you would die on a specific month that was coming up, it didn't necessarily mean this year. Instead, you could live a long and healthy life completely forgetting about that prophecy until you go to sleep during that month as an old person and never wake up, fulfilling the prophecy. The only things that Nick knew for certain was the fixed points that simply couldn't be changed regardless of whatever actions he took. The first was that Grindelwald could not be stopped from completing his ritual, while the second was the return of the surviving gods. The rest was vague and as such gave Nick some room to wiggle about and push the odds in his favor. For example, if he could figure out where Zeus is sealed at, he could set traps for the weakened god before he was released. The opposite was also true with the likes of Hephaestus, as he could set recovery items near the sealed craft god so that he could work with him almost immediately. Chapter 380, Final Days of the Year. Nick basically isolated himself in the workshop for the next 28 days as he put his new power to good use. Dumbledore gave Nick a suspicious look at the end of this time when he turned in so many more rings than usual. In the end, the old goat paid Nick for his work and chose to ignore his strange increase in ability. The old man wasn't stupid and easily figured out what had happened for Nick to have such a sharp growth in power. He himself had in fact used rituals when he was younger, so he knew which Nick had likely used. 2 days before the students were kicked out of the school, they were also freed to do whatever they wished as the exams were over. I swear Snape's exam was the worst of the lot, pretty sure the greasy bloke was trying to make us fail. Ron complained to Nick. At the moment, Nick and his friends were sitting in the workshop relaxing and just hanging out. The man does seem like that most of the time, but I'm sure he wasn't doing it intentionally. Nick said honestly. Literally everyone in the school noticed that Snape had mellowed out greatly after Voldemort died. He was by no means nice, but at the very least he wasn't in a perpetually foul mood anymore. He had also stopped targeting Harry so much and actually took his job teaching the class properly. The increase in grades also showed, as he was no longer so harsh with his grading. "How's your scar doing anyways, Harry?" Nick asked, changing the topic. "It's getting better every day. Guess that means he really is gone," Harry said with a smile. "Good riddance. That man caused so many problems that even now we haven't fixed," Tracy said hatefully. The Green Grasses and Davis families had suffered a lot under Voldemort as part of the Grey faction of the Wisengamot, and that hatred still lingers even now. Dumbledore hadn't told Harry how exactly Voldemort was forced into that final pathetic end, so none of Nick's friends knew of his involvement in the matter. Nick was more than happy to keep it that way too, as it would cause drama if they learned the truth. Still, for the first time in nearly a decade, those living in fear of the man's return were breathing much easier as the news was leaked about his permanent death. "That reminds me, but what are your plans for the summer, Nick?" Harry asked curiously, and the rest of his friends were also very interested in his answer. "Not all that much really, as I was going to be spending most of my time on my island." "Why?" Nick answered with a question of his own. "Sirius wanted to invite you to the upcoming Chudley Cannons Quidditch game," Harry said honestly. "I thought my dislike of the sport was public knowledge." Nick asked, surprised at the invitation. "That's what I told him, but he insisted, something about all work and no play. Dunno what he was going on about, to be honest with you," Harry said with a shrug. "As much as I appreciate the offer, I will have to decline. I might invite you all over to the island though. Merlin knows it could use some visitors to liven up the place," Nick said with a grin. "Still can't believe you have your own island," Ron said enviously. "And I'm surprised that more people don't. Seriously, ancient wizards seem to love the things for some reason, yet very few modern wizards have one," Nick replied in frustration. It honestly made no sense to him that the frankly abundant islands around the country weren't taken by the old pureblood families or even Muggle-born wizards researching stuff in secret. Nick was extremely happy to have his own island after all, as the privacy simply couldn't be beaten unless he went into his realm. It wouldn't even be all that difficult to make the islands disappear using modern runestones and wards to obscure the land. "Asked my mom about that actually, and she said that it was too costly to keep up if you weren't living there," Daphne added to the conversation. "I suppose that I could see that with the storms and frequent rain that an island would get. My ancestor solved that problem with her skill as an enchanter, but for most it would probably be bloody hard to take care of," Nick said in agreement. He had a bad habit of forgetting just how good he had it in this regard and had not considered this problem till now. "Still, I bet the island is an amazing place, right?" Hermione asked curiously. "I suppose so. It's got its own dangers though, so don't wander off on your own if you value your safety," Nick said seriously. Chapter 381, Final Days of the Year, 2. "It can't be that bad, right?" Hermione asked curiously. Nick shrugged. Depends on what you consider dangerous as well as the circumstances of your visit. If you somehow broke into the island despite the wards, then it would be a nightmare, as there are grab-horns, griff-cats, horned water serpents, Colorado and a very powerful manticore guardian. That doesn't even begin to talk about the magical plants and less dangerous creatures. If you are a guest on the island though, most of these things aren't a problem unless you decide to make them one. He said casually. You do realize that the magical creatures you listed off are almost all XXXX or higher rated dangerous creatures, right? Daphne asked seriously. Yes, what about it? He replied casually. You know it's illegal to import or own creatures like that, right? Daphne pressed sternly. Nick just waved it off. Though I don't own any of those creatures though, I own the land they live on, which last I checked was not a crime. He pointed out smugly. That's a dangerous line to tiptoe around, so I hope you know what you are doing. Daphne said worriedly before letting the topic drop. You don't got any spider there, do you? Ron asked with a shudder. Last time I checked I only had the normal sort plus one species of the magical kind, but they are pretty small. Nick said honestly. What sort is it? Hermione asked, interested. South African jewel weaver, Nick answered with a shrug. X-rated dangerous creature with numbing venom, prized for their stone webs that shine like jewels under direct light. I read about them in the library. Hermione explained, and Nick nodded. The species was almost non-magical in nature if it wasn't for the fact that their webs were clearly magical. They were also both very shy of people, and their venom was almost harmless, which allowed them to have a very low danger rating in general. The kind on Nick's island were not much different from that rating, other than that the change from the heavy mana had made them more potent and larger than normal. Even after that change though, they were basically just tarantulas with really nice to look at webs. The most dangerous creatures on the island after the change though was the horned water snakes and the manticore, Seram. The horned water snakes had evolved, or rather underwent atavism, into a creature that had long since went extinct, a hydra. There was unfortunately only a single member of the group on the island to turn into a hydra, while the rest went on to become evolved versions of the normal horned water snake species. Ironically, the hydra chose to live in the tiny pond on the eastern side of the island, and like one would expect was fairly territorial. Nick was forced to place a small filtration barrier in the small streams leading to and from that pond, as the hydra's venom was no joking matter and was causing problems for the fish there. Other than that, none of the species on the island really made any jumps in danger like that single horned water snake did. Seram grew an extra set of black leathery bat wings and gained some serious size, reaching the size of an African elephant, but otherwise didn't experience much of a shift. The venom from her scorpion tail though got a nice boost in potency, which was nice. Nazgul, however, was the undisputed queen of the island, as not a single creature on it was willing to stand up to her, including the hydra. Then again, I don't think any creature is stupid enough to try and fight something that can rip out your soul as easy as breathing. I thought with a chuckle as I scratched my horribly cuddly danger beast behind her horns. Speaking of, should I send a letter first, or would showing up unannounced work just as well? Nick asked calmly. My folks wouldn't mind if you showed up unannounced, so long as there was no nasty surprises this time. Ron said with a shrug. Sirius said you are always welcome, so same. Harry said as well. Our parents aren't going to be happy if you suddenly show up, so send a letter beforehand. Tracy said for both her and Daphne. My parents would probably be fine with a sudden visit, but it may be best if you send a letter ahead of time. Hermione said, and Luna followed with, Papa might want to come too. Nick made a point to remember these arrangements for later and let the rest of the day flow smoothly without trying to control it. Soon enough it was time to bid farewell for now, and Nick had Dottie take him directly to the island. Chapter 382, Teaching. Nick shuddered as the dense mana rolled over him on the island, but quickly adjusted. It was hard to describe the sort of hellish craving that came from going from rich mana to poor mana on a magical being. There weren't any withdrawal symptoms or anything like that, but there was this sense of weakness that was very bothersome to deal with. It actually made Nick wonder how the hell the gods even allowed the world to deplete to this point without stopping it. After all, he assumed that this feeling got so much worse when you were a higher-tiered being, as it was likely tied to your very life. Wizards naturally lived longer the higher tier they were on average compared to muggles, so in theory it was quite easy for a tier 7 or 8 being to live for a stupid long time just based on this power. Nick doubted that the gods or titans were actually immortal by birth, but very long-lived was definitely doable. Anyway, he walked into the manor after arriving on the island and went to find Lucas. The reason for this was because as Nick's assistant, the vampire needed to see the sort of things he would be learning in the future. Nick had thought about having Helena as his assistant, but as a ghost she simply couldn't grow in the way that would allow her to improve in the styles he had. Celebrumber style directly grows the soul, while Twilight style was all about mana control. Helena simply couldn't improve either of these facets past the point she was at when she was alive, which was an immediate disqualifier for an assistant. Lucas may not be all that talented, but he was both unaging and capable of growing alongside the styles. Nick was honestly glad that he got the Twilight style instead of something else, as while Lucas was learning it, it would help him get the level of mana control needed to feel his own spirit. That was the first step of the Celebrumber style and was nearly impossible to teach without a stupid high amount of self-awareness. Nick learned the style from the system, which allowed him to jump over this barrier immediately, but Lucas has no such aid and thus needed to learn it the hard way. Once Lucas gained ample mana control, Nick was going to stick him in a sensory deprivation chamber so he could focus on himself without distractions. The vampire in question was currently studying the guide to metals Nick had left him while looking over the metals that Dottie bought with its salary. There weren't any super rare materials in the mix, but the house elf clearly found a good supplier, as there was things like tungsten. "Ignore that stuff for now and follow me," Nick said, and Lucas looked confused but obeyed. "What's up, boss?" he asked curiously. "It's time for you to get a taste of the sort of work you will be doing in time," Nick said without actually explaining anything. Lucas perked up at this, however, as he was wondering what sort of stuff he would be taught eventually, but understood that he needed to start from the basics first. He had traveled around for a few years, so he had picked up a thing or two and even regretted not trying harder while in Hogwarts, because much of that fundamental knowledge needed to be relearned in order to pick up these new skills. It was also why he wasn't complaining about getting stuck with this tedious learning that Nick had him doing. That said, though, Lucas had gotten the house elf to bring him the old papers that covered Nick so that he could get an understanding the sort of person he was working for. He found out quickly that Nick was not exaggerating when he said he was well known for his skill in crafting. This wasn't to say that he doubted Nick all that much to begin with, as after receiving the flask and ring from him he was a believer. After reading these news articles, however, he couldn't help but think that he lucked out hard to land this job coincidentally like that. Nick didn't care about these thoughts of Lucas's and led the way to the room that held the Atronach forge installation. "What in Merlin's sweaty robes is that?" Lucas exclaimed after seeing the many-ringed device spinning and humming in mid-air for the first time. "This wonderful construction of mine is called the Atronach forge, and its purpose is to create things based on the materials I give it. In this case it will be creating a new life form," Nick explained with a proud smile. Chapter 383, Teaching, 2. "Isn't that illegal though?" Lucas asked with a confused expression. "Horribly so. Then again, if the ministry knew the laundry list of crimes I've committed, they'd bury me under Azkaban, so one more makes no difference," Nick replied with a shrug. Lucas just stared at him in stupefaction after getting that answer, while Nick casually took out the blood-bound diamond and tossed it accurately into the center of the Atronach forge alongside a few bars of goblin silver. This snapped Lucas's attention back to normal, as the gem left a heavy blood smell the moment it appeared. The ingredients floated in place within the forge, and Nick tapped his wand on the outer ring of the forge and started the process. A vast amount of mana was sucked into the diamond that started to glow brightly, with most of it coming from Nick himself. Lucas watched on in fascination as the diamond slowly started to break down into tiny grains of brightly glowing sand that spread out before the vast quantity of mana started to transform into pale yellowish sandy-looking stones with swirl patterns all over them. At first the stones didn't seem to have any real shape, but as more and more formed one began to appear. One humanoid face followed by a second to the left of the first, made out of this stone material, then one arm followed by another until there were 4 arms. Finally 4 long pale yellowish stone swords with swirl patterns formed in the hands of the creature. At this point the metal broke down and flowed over the edges of the swords as well as the surface of the stones that made up the creature's body, filling in the swirl patterns. The final result was a greater air Atronach with 4 arms and 2 faces that was reinforced integrally with goblin silver. The rings of the Atronach forge slowed down once its job was done, and the Atronach came to life as the gaps between its stones glowed blue gently. The air in the room howled as the power of the creature ran without restraint, and the rocks shifted continuously while still maintaining its shape somehow. "Come!" Nick commanded, and the Atronach floated forward out of the forge until it was in front of him obediently. "Greater air Atronach on my first attempt, not bad at all," Nick said happily after he checked the creature over. "What even is this thing?" Lucas asked, confused beyond measure. "Alright. I forgot I haven't taught you that yet, apologies. Anyways, this wonderful thing is a type of creature that is generally known as an Atronach. In simple terms, Atronachs are elemental magic given shape and life. For this one in particular, it is an air Atronach, which means that its main elemental alignment is to the air element. Don't let those stones fool you. This thing is almost entirely made of air magic that has been crystallized into what you see now, with the exception of the metal that I added to it," Nick explained with a smile. "Is it dangerous?" Lucas asked nervously while looking at the strange construct. "Only if you attack it or I command it to be. Right now though it's pretty much just decoration. Sure, it might move around but it won't do anything else really," Nick said honestly. "Restrain your power and follow me." He then commanded the Atronach, and the winds in the room vanished for the most part. "Will I learn how to do this eventually?" Lucas asked eagerly at this display. "That's the idea. In time you will serve as my assistant in most crafting matters, but for now you are still learning," Nick answered before walking out of the room with the Atronach following closely behind him. He dismissed Lucas after that, and the vampire went back to his studying with a renewed vigor. Nick on the other hand brought the Atronach outside the manor and set it on a patrol route around it after taking the time to set the construct's aggression to the minimum. He didn't mind if the thing retaliated after being attacked, but he definitely didn't want it turning violent towards anything in sight that breathes. Should such a thing happen, Nick would likely have to suffer serious damage to the island's ecosystem before he could stop the Atronach. Rather than deal with it, he simply set it on a passive patrol loop around the manor. It was certainly intimidating enough that most creatures that might accidentally wander into the area of the manor would probably think twice about messing with it. The best part of Atronachs in Nick's opinion though was that should someone see them, he could simply say it was a golem and no one could say otherwise. Chapter 384, Flame Atronach Experiments. With proof of concept now established, Nick now set out to create as many Atronachs as he could. The first Atronach type he focused on was the fire Atronachs because he had a theory about them that he wanted to verify. The process to creating them was similar to the way the air Atronach was created, however Nick didn't add any metal to the forge. What he ended up with was weaker than normal constructs that looked like women without faces, made out of fire and burnt metal. In truth, there was no metal on the creatures at all, as it was simply crystallized mana like with the air Atronach. In theory, I can feed a fire seed to these Atronachs in order to change their powers and appearance, Nick thought as he took a deep breath before breathing out a thick plume of azure flames at the Atronach. To his surprise, this created a strange chiming sound from the construct, and to his magical senses the Atronach was undergoing a fundamental shift. Even after he stopped releasing his flames on the Atronach, the changes continued, and he watched in interest as the body of the Atronach began to change. The biggest shift was clearly that the coloration of the construct was now azure and dark blue. Even more interesting to Nick was how the construct had grown ever so slightly larger and had grown twisted horns on its head that its flaming hair flowed around. Appearance-wise there wasn't any other changes, but in terms of power there was a night and day difference. Before, the construct was made of normal flames, but now it was comprised of mana-dense dragon flames and was thus considerably more powerful than it was before. Nick set this new azure flame Atronach on patrol as well before going to meditate to restore his mana reserves. It would seem that I can only make approximately 4 Atronachs a day if I don't want to lower the ambient mana density of the island, he thought as he cleared his mind and focused on his breathing. It wasn't a lot, but considering they were permanently here after he made them, that number will quickly increase as he spends more and more time creating the things. Still, the next 2 Atronachs he made were also flame Atronachs that he then fed a fire seed from one of the types of flames he had available. The Atronach fed the cold flames imploded during the transformation, which he discovered was because the base level of the construct was too weak to handle the conflicting energies created by the transformation. Still, he theorized that a better starting point for the flame Atronach should fix this problem. It wasn't a total loss though, as upon its death the Atronach's body broke down into a glowing red salt pile. Fire salts, I take it. These may come in very handy soon when I start delving into alchemy, he thought as he stored the burning hot salts away in a highly heat-resistant glass jar. The final Atronach was fed a seed of conjunction flame and things got weird as a result. Nick watched as the Atronach violently transformed. First the legs, head and arms sank into the torso of the construct. Then the torso ballooned until Nick was looking at a perfectly round orb of glowing grey flame crystals. Even weirder was that the Atronach seemed to warp space slightly just by existing. Nick set this new conjunction Atronach as the centerpiece of the manor's reception area, as it was a marvel to look at but didn't seem suited for combat at all. Nick had to call it a day there with his creation of Atronachs, as the ambient mana was getting rather thin. The rest of the day he practiced his mana control in order to regain the control he lost from the sudden increase in power. His wand had already adjusted to this new level of power, so it didn't have any issue with his training. Thankfully, Nick's control hadn't been truly lost so much as dulled by the increase in power. All he needed to get back to where he was previously as a bit of sharpening. Nick had Dottie cook up a meal for him while he relaxed in the bathroom. It might be rather wasteful that the bath was almost the size of a swimming pool, but it was pleasant nonetheless. The hot mineral waters of the bath did wonders for getting rid of stubborn dirt and dead skin after a short soak. Thanks to Daphne's hair care routine, my now shoulder-length grey hair was smooth and shiny like silver. I tended to keep it braided behind my ears in a traditional 11 manner that Celebrumber showed me. Chapter 385, Unexpected Guest. After his bath, Nick got dressed in his pajamas before heading for the manor's dining room to eat dinner. It was a simple meal of vegetable beef stew, but in such a large quantity that it could be mistaken as a party-sized portion. Sadly, it was not, as Nick and Steve were the ones eating it entirely. Nazgul's dinner, on the other hand, involved a large portion of Colorado soles and all. Much like the Acromantulas, though, there were so many on the island that she barely dented their numbers. Dusk, meanwhile, was eating off of a platter stacked high with barbecued meat while in his tiny fuzzball form, since he finally underwent rebirth to regrow his tail feather. The one he had lost because of Peeves had been in Nick's possession since that day, but he was saving it for a special purpose. To be specific, Nick was planning to create a very powerful wand out of it, but hadn't had the time to devote to veritology until now to really improve his mastery of the subject. At best, his wood and rune carving skills had improved greatly, but the subject was more than just those two facets. It involved a clear understanding of how the wand core and wood would interact, as well as the various quirks of both. The ironic part was that veritology only became a real craft when a wand maker a long time ago realized that sticks with runes on them weren't the most efficient way to create a magical focus. The exact history of how wands came to take the forms they had today was long and mostly vague or entirely lost to time. What Nick did know, though, was that the craft had been refined by generation after generation of crafters into what it was now. For example, Nick knew for certain that over 1,000 years ago, during the Founder's time, wands were created out of whatever magical components someone brought to a wand maker. The wood used for them was roughly the same as today, but the cores were strange and sometimes didn't even work. Crazy magical things like mandrake leaves, the heart of their most loyal hound, and other morbid or just odd things. From what Nick understood, though, the item was required to be obtained by the wand's owner personally. This led to a mass of hunting magical beasts to get their powerful parts in order to create a more powerful wand. Interestingly enough, though, the act of hunting one's own wand core material actually did create a stronger bond between owner and wand. The problem came in the form of compatibility between the core and the wizard. Ollivander solved this problem by introducing the Supreme Core theory when he was much younger. This let everyone have a equally powerful wand that was perfectly compatible with them at the cost of the extra power granted by hunting a core themselves. Sadly, there was a very large problem with wands in general that anyone paying attention to history could spot. After they were introduced, it suddenly became much harder to grow very powerful, and the average level of power amongst the magical community dropped sharply. The reason for this was that the wielders of the wands stopped remembering that the wands were tools to help them cast magic, not the source of the magic. A wizard stripped of their wand suddenly found themselves at the mercy of their enemy, and thus little better than a muggle. Slowly the mastery of magic itself that the ancient wizards had faded until mere wisps of it remained in the ancient tombs scattered around the world. But none of that is my business at the moment, Nick thought after finishing his meal and heading up to his room to sleep. As a vampire, Lucas didn't actually need to sleep, so a single light in the manor remained on for the rest of the night. Nick was alerted by the ward to the island that someone had entered the island without permission slightly before dawn, which woke him up. Was it dumb luck, or did someone actually manage to track me down somehow, he thought as he got dressed and rushed out of the room in a rush. We have an unexpected visitor, prepare for combat, Nick said seriously before Lucas could even say good morning. Lucas immediately pulled out his own wand from before he became a vampire with a serious expression before following Nick. They quickly made their way out of the manor, and Nick commanded the Atronachs patrolling the outskirts of the manor to follow them closely. A loud roar came from the northern part of the island that Nick recognized as belonging to Saram, and they hurried over that way. Chapter 386, Overwhelming Force. The island was only a few miles across, so it didn't take long for Nick and Lucas to arrive at the outskirts of the battle between Saram and the intruder. You have got to be kidding me, Nick thought with a dumbfounded look at the scene that greeted them upon arrival. Standing at the cliff's edge was a small old man that looked frail enough for the wind to blow over, that had shoulder-length thin white hair. In the man's hand was a pale white wooden wand that had a blood-red stone the size of a quail egg affixed to its base. The crazy part, however, was that Saram was fighting a dozen stone soldiers that were clearly giving her a run for her money if the injuries on her were any indication. As if that wasn't bad enough, whenever she would tear one of the soldiers apart, the old wizard would merely wave his wand and the soldier would be repaired. You two help the Manticore fight off the stone soldiers. Lucas with me on the wizard. Nick barked out commands to the Atronachs and Lucas before sprinting towards the old man. Nick didn't recognize the magical signature of the wizard on his island, and thus decided to attack first and ask questions later. Saram looked relieved once the Atronachs joined her against the stone soldiers, as the constructs were very effective against them, relieving a lot of pressure. Come, child. I haven't felt this good in decades, let me shake off this rust, the wizard said with a wide smile as Nick raised his wand to attack. Agled. He spoke, and the wizard's smile vanished as he hurriedly raised a shield charm in defense. Crack. Boom. Not a moment too soon either, as the instant Nick finished speaking, a barrel-thick bolt of lightning flew from the tip of the wand towards the wizard. The wizard dodged to the side immediately after the lightning struck the shield, as cracks formed instantly on it. Nick was not playing around right now and wanted to end this fight as soon as possible. The wizard didn't miss a beat though, and mid-dodge sent a bright red spell at Nick. Stabbing his wand forward, Nick caught the spell with the mana-coated tip of his wand and flicked it to the side. The wizard saw this and had a look of surprise before smiling again and sending volley of 5 more spells at Nick, all wordlessly cast and moving at different speeds. Nick's eyes flicked between each of them before the rest of his body started to react to the new spells. Swish. 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 Nick's right hand moved in a blur as he caught and deflected the spells one after another while taking a deep breath. Fwom. A thick gout of azure fire leaves Nick's mouth and forces the wizard to stop attacking and defend. The shield summoned this time was much sturdier than the first and held out pretty well against the violent flames. Not well enough that the wizard wasn't showing signs of struggle, however, as he fought against the torrent of flames. Nick cut off the flames as he was running out of breath before moving his wand reducto. Bombarda Maxima. Hydri Fumi can't. The first and second spells forced the wizard to leave the shield or risk getting blown to pieces, while the last was Nick's personally modified toxic smoke spell. This would force the wizard to try and get rid of the horribly corrosive smoke or risk getting eaten to the bones. Just like Nick planned, the wizard dodged out of the way of the first two spells and hurriedly dealt with the third spell. At this point a mist reformed behind the wizard as Lucas used the difficult-to-spot mist form to sneak up on the wizard. Expelliarmus. He spoke and the wizard was unable to react in time from the sudden attack in a different direction, thus losing their wand. Nick wasted no time at all, tapping his wand on the ground and transfiguring the ground to swallow the wizard and his wand, while having several sharp spears of metal pressed against his body from all angles. Saram and the Atronachs made quick work of the stone soldiers at that point, as the wizard couldn't restore them anymore. Wonderful. Simply marvelous, child. To think I would be caught off guard in such a manner, I'm truly embarrassed. The wizard said with a laugh from his hole in the ground. Who are you and how did you find this place? Nick asked seriously, with his wand pointed at the man threateningly. Oh good, my new cloaking enchantment is working then, your help was invaluable to make it, you know. I admit that I may have miscalculated on the reaction you would have when planning this little surprise. The man said with an awkward chuckle. Chapter 387, Flamel's Visit. Nick was confused when he heard this, as he didn't remember helping anyone with a cloaking enchantment. No, wait, I did point out some flaws for one such thing not that long ago, he thought, and realized who was currently in a hole being poked by sharp spears. You realize I could have killed you, right, Mr. Flamel? Nick said with a groan as he released the eccentric alchemist. The thought did indeed cross my mind once or twice recently. What gave me away this time? The old man said while picking up his wand. I haven't helped anyone with a cloaking enchantment except you. Nick said honestly. Ah. Yes, well, I do suppose that would make it rather obvious. Speaking of, this must be the young vampire that you took not long ago. Nicholas Flamel, pleased to meet you. The alchemist said while greeting Lucas. Nick frowned at that. How would you know about that? Not even Dumbledore should be aware of this matter. He asked, confused. I happen to be friends with several vampires, you see, and one of them spilled this juicy piece of gossip over tea a week ago. You really should remember to have your house elf wear normal clothes if you want it to remain unidentified. Flamel said with a teasing look. Nick groaned as he had totally forgotten about that, as it was normal to him at this point for his house elf to be wearing the fancy clothes. How did you even find this place anyways? I personally checked to make sure that the wards didn't have any defects after all. Nick said seriously. Well, I sort of cheated actually. Left a tracking charm on your familiar at the pageant since I knew she wouldn't be far from you at any given moment. Then I simply apparat to the nearest spot on the map and went looking for out-of-place magics. I must admit that it was a fun little challenge to crack the ward scheme and get in. Flamel said with a smile. This is a guest, I assume? Saram asked calmly after walking up. Nick nodded. Yeah, he is a bit eccentric and decided to make an unplanned visit. Good work, by the way. He said with honest praise at the end. It's my job, the giant manticore said with a bored shrug. Fascinating, I have never seen a manticore quite like you at all. Is it because of the mana concentration perhaps? Flamel asked Saram, interested. Nick just shook his head and sighed. You can go back to your business, Saram, I'll take it from here. He said, and the manticore walked off back into the forest casually. Not you two, come here. Nick commanded the Atronachs that went to follow after Saram. Flamel walked up to the Atronachs with an intrigued look. Golems? No, far too complex for that. What manner of things are you, I wonder? He muttered with confusion. Atronachs, a sort of elemental construct that I created. Nick says honestly. Fascinating, but I can't help but notice that they lack any signs of alchemical treatment. How did you create them without it? Flamel asked curiously. We can talk back at the manor, but first I need to check the wards to make sure the island isn't exposed to the rest of the world. Nick said, and Flamel nodded in understanding. It didn't take Nick long to find the part of the ward scheme that Flamel broke in from and repair it back to the way it was supposed to be. Nick led Flamel patiently through the forest of the island to the manor and honestly didn't mind how the old alchemist would stop every time he saw something interesting. He had long since known that should anyone with real knowledge and power like Flamel come to the island, they would probably be enamored with its uniqueness. Still, eventually they got to the manor and Nick set the Atronachs back to their patrols while Lucas was allowed to go back to whatever he was doing. Flamel was in wonder when he saw the conjunction flame Atronach in the reception hall, as he clearly knew what the flames were. "Can I offer you some tea? Perhaps a snack?" Nick asked as he sat down in the guest area with Flamel. "Yes, I would quite fancy a cup of tea. I can do without any snacks though," Flamel said with a smile. Nick nodded and called Dottie before having them brew a pot of tea for him and Flamel. "I must say that I never expected that this place would have such a high amount of mana. Is there any particular reason for that?" the alchemist asked curiously. "I needed it to create the Atronachs. They are made of crystallized elemental mana after all. That reminds me, but you might get some better use out of this than me for the moment," Nick said while handing over the jar of fire salts. Chapter 388, Flamel's Visit, 2. "Oh? And what might this be?" the alchemist said while studying the glowing red salt he had just been given. "Fire salt. When an Atronach perishes, its body breaks down into shelf-stable crystal dust that contains dense elemental mana. That jar came from a fire Atronach, hence the name," Nick explained honestly. "I see. What a curious creation these Atronachs of yours are. You never did explain how you were able to make them without alchemy," Flamel pointed out with a smile. "I used an incredibly complex enchantment actually. I can't show it to you though since it's rather special and I would like to keep it to myself," Nick explained apologetically. "Rather disappointing, but I can understand. I couldn't help but notice that Vampire was able to use regular magic. Your work, I take it?" the old alchemist said curiously. "It is not that hard to do if you understand vampirism's effect on the magic in the body and have a way to change it to a degree. In Lucas's case, I split the mana distribution from his core between his blood and magical network," Nick explained without any problem. Flamel had been around for over 600 years and was naturally a very curious individual, so Nick doubted it could have been that hard to eventually figure out for him. The Atronach Forge, on the other hand, was an entirely different story, as Daedric runes were an integral part of its construction, and so while it was technically possible to recreate without them, it would be no laughing matter for even someone like the great alchemist. "Ah yes, I believe I came to a similar conclusion at one point but hadn't put it into practice for fear of causing undue harm should my calculations go awry," Flamel said honestly. "Well, it wouldn't work on anyone below the first threshold, as the split places heavy strain on the mana core, but otherwise an even distribution of mana only caused 3.5 weeks of weakness in Lucas, who was on a steady diet of dragon's blood," Nick shared freely. "Dragon blood? Rather expensive for meals, no?" the alchemist asked in surprise. "A minor inconvenience at worst. The real problem was shaking the rust off of his spell work. A few years of stagnation almost voided the 7 he spent in school," Nick said with frustration. That was really a problem for Nick, as he had to add in the full 7 years curriculum to Lucas's studies in order to refresh his foundation. Since he had already learned the material, it didn't take the vampire long to get back in the swing of it, but it was still frustrating to deal with nonetheless. "I imagine so, considering the large differences between normal magic and blood magic. That misty ability of his was also your doing, yes?" Flamel asked curiously. "Yup, I gave him an extra 4 bloodline abilities, turning him into a royal vampire in exchange for his loyalty. A fair deal if you ask me," Nick said with a grin. "Oh? Now that is certain to anger that vampress. Are you sure that was a wise decision?" Flamel asked curiously. "It doesn't matter if she is mad about it, since he outranks her now. Not to mention, if I chose to release the information that Lucas was working for me to the public, he would immediately have more political power than she does. I solved all but any covered methods of retribution already," Nick said with a grin. What of the Teeps Royals? The alchemist asked with a slight facial twitch that Nick was sure had a story behind it. Well, 4 possibilities exist if they are even half as intelligent as they are portrayed. First is that they will seek to marry Lucas into the Teeps Royals so that they remain in absolute control while adding a powerful new force to their members. Second is that they try to have him killed for the same reason as the first, but this is unlikely unless they also wish to anger me. Third is that they will allow Lucas to build up his own forces to relieve some of the pressure on them with a few concessions from him. The final option is of course that they entirely ignore him as he is not the important factor in this affair. I am. Nick said calmly. I see you have given this matter the appropriate thought, so I will not bother about it any longer. The alchemist said before taking a sip of the tea he just brought. How unusual. The last time I tasted a tea like this was when I found an ancient wizard's storage room under stasis thanks to a Chrono Stone. Flamel said with a smile. Chapter 389, Chat. Nick was surprised to hear this, as Chrono Stones were horribly rare natural minerals that had the innate ability to mess with time itself. The most common use for the things was to slow down the flow of time in a specific hour to the point of almost complete stagnation. This allowed one to extend the shelf life of pretty much anything by many times. For example, if an item that would only last a second normally was placed within such an area, it could last hundreds or even thousands of years. Unfortunately, ancient wizards had mined nearly every one of these stones from the planet long ago for their own uses, making them very rare to find. In modern times, the most well-known use for the mineral was to grind it into sand and place it in a special alchemical device that harnessed the stone's power to allow for time travel, in other words time turners. Flamel noticed Nick's surprise at the mention of the Chrono Stone and was impressed. I am surprised you know of Chrono Stones, they are considered lost knowledge by most. He said honestly. There is a book on alchemical items in Hogwarts library that mentions them. Nick explained with a shrug before taking out an English translated version he copied from the realm and handing it over. Flamel quickly flipped through the pages and casually pointed out a few flawed or incorrect pieces of information, but verified that the book did indeed contain knowledge on Chrono Stones. I recognize your handwriting, so I assume you copied the book personally. Flamel asked while handing the copy back. Nick nodded. I like to collect knowledge like that and figured it would be a good addition to my personal library. He said honestly. He had no reason to lie to the old alchemist about such things, as the man likely had a very good grasp over reading people and was unlikely to care about his knowledge or abilities. A common habit for wizards to have, though most simply take the original source instead of making a copy. Flamel said with an understanding look. It might serve better in the school's library. Now that I think about it, why are you here exactly, since I doubt it was just to get put in danger? Nick asked curiously. We didn't get to speak as much as I would have liked when you were at the pageant, and I decided to rectify that. It seems this was a wise decision on my part, as you clearly have all sorts of wonderful knowledge. Flamel explained with a smile. Not to mention this dense level of ambient mana that is quickly rejuvenating me. He added. What do you mean? Nick asked confused. Even during their previous meeting, Nick saw nothing that would indicate that Flamel was suffering mana deprivation. You have already mentioned tears during this conversation, so I assume you are at least vaguely aware of the different levels of power a magical being could have, yes? Flamel asked and Nick nodded. Then you are also likely aware of the term mana deprivation, correct? He asked and again Nick nodded. Due to the rather minuscule amount of ambient mana in the world, no 5th tier being is capable of surviving under normal circumstances, which is known as mana deprivation. My wife Pernell and I have long since crossed the 5th tier, but have had to suppress ourselves back to the 4th and even rely on that stone to survive, but we are only just surviving. Flamel explained sadly. Our bodies atrophy and are frail while our magics are limited as a result of centuries of mana deprivation. But this island has such a vast amount of mana that just being here is alleviating those symptoms. He explains, and Nick was left stunned momentarily. He had assumed that Flamel had figured out how to take that step, but never could have guessed that he had taken it centuries prior and had been suffering mana deprivation this whole time. Why didn't you just do what I did and draw in and trap large amounts of mana? Nick asked, confused on this point. There were 3 reasons for that. First was that I would need a ley line nexus to do that, much like this island here. Stagnant mana tends to cause problems after all. The second reason was that we would then become prisoners within our own home, which was much worse than a little discomfort. The final reason was that we weren't seeking greater power, so it wasn't necessary to survive and live a full life. Flamel explained honestly. I think I understand what you mean, though admittedly I don't think I would have made the same choice in your place. Nick said before taking a sip of tea. Chapter 390, Chat, 2. I am not surprised to hear that. You do see every bit the ambitious young man after all. Flamel said with a chuckle. That reminds me, what was that flame you used during the duel earlier? He asked after taking a sip of tea. A byproduct of undergoing a slightly modified ritual of breath. Nick explained calmly. Flamel nodded in understanding. You added to properties of the dragon's lungs to your own, rather risky if you didn't have an affinity for flames already, no? He asked rhetorically. Nick held up his left hand and a match-size flame rose from his palm soundlessly. There was no risk involved in that case. He said with a grin. Pyrokinesis? A powerful and useful gift to have in your craft. Flamel said slightly enviously. It doesn't actually see much use in that regard, honestly. It's bloody hard to control abnormal flames with it, you know. Nick said with a sigh as he dismissed the flame. Perhaps, but you do still have some control nonetheless, which most in your craft would give their limbs for. Personally, I think an eagle's vision might be the best suited gift for craftsmen in general. Flamel said honestly. I can see why. Details are very important in most crafts, so being able to see more of them would likely help considerably. Perhaps I should look for a ritual to enhance your sight. Nick pondered out loud. While I appreciate the offer, there is no need, since I can merely design one if I truly wish it. Don't let Albus know about your use of rituals though, as he dislikes most of them after some bad experiences previously. Flamel warned seriously. I will keep that in mind. Nick agreed. How goes the compendium of enchantments, by the way? Flamel asked, changing the subject. They chatted for a few hours after that before the old alchemist left with an invitation to learn under him. Nick would be lying if he said that he wasn't very interested in the offer, but he was aware that he needed to clean off some of the work on his plate before he can devote time studying a new and very complex subject like alchemy. He still needed to master the core curriculum of Hogwarts, create a small army of Atronachs, improve his organic smithing method, expand and strengthen his knowledge on the Twilight style, and complete his modifications of the animagus ritual. Each of these were long-term projects in their own right, and together left him with little free time to indulge in a new subject. Today alone he needed to create another 4 Atronachs before working on the magic of the higher years of the curriculum for the rest. Nick was going to put off the other things for a different day, as these 2 were the most pressing. The Atronachs were as easy as feeding the forge the gems and mana with meditation between each one to restore his mana. The curriculum, on the other hand, required Nick to practice fervently. Meanwhile, a certain group was having a rather bad time as they tried and failed to find Nick. I don't understand how the kid could just drop off the face of the planet after causing so much trouble like this. A man with strikingly similar features to Nick said with frustration. The man was holding an orb that had a female voice speaking from in a series of hisses. What the man heard was very different, however. The elder seems to think the brat is holed up on the Ravenclaw Island under cloaking wards that stop divination from seeing it. We are also having trouble convincing Lady Sturm that the brat is exiled to us, and as such his actions are not our doing. You know how natural-born vampires can be over stuff like this. The female voice said with no small amount of irritation. Yeah, this nephew of mine has proven to be surprisingly elusive and skilled after we exiled him for lacking magical ability. Even without any memories, he has started to expose us to the world as people search for anyone related to him. The man said with a sad look. The elder's orders are clear, Monroe. He gets brought back in the fold or erased before he becomes too powerful. The female voice said in French this time. We are long past that point if the reports on Voldemort are right, the man thinks but verbally agrees. The orb stops glowing and the man puts it into a leather bag at his side. I wonder just how much we haven't seen from you yet, little bird, he thinks before vanishing in a puff of smoke. Chapter 391, Poor Decision. Nick spent the next week focusing entirely on these two things and made a good amount of progress on both of them. There were now 28 lesser Atronachs of various kinds on the island and he had almost finished the 6th year material. Hogwarts' curriculum had a bit of a snowball effect in that each previous year's materials made the next easier to understand in compounding effects. Jumping from 1st year to 7th directly was much harder than doing the same from the 2nd or 3rd year. It was a simple matter of complexity getting broken down and fed in manageable amounts. The final year's materials, for example, were almost the same as the 6th year's except they were more complex. Still, Nick knew from experience that learning this stuff helped tremendously when learning other advanced things. For example, learning the charms coursework made it easier to understand foreign spells and thus counter them. With that knowledge, it made sense that Flitwick, who taught the subject, was also a very skilled duelist. Transfiguration, on the other hand, had a use in almost every facet of wizarding life, from crafting to paperwork. For example, the paper plane spell that the Ministry used was 1 part transfiguration and 2 parts charms. It was for this reason that many jobs after graduation required certain scores in certain subjects. For example, to become an auror, one must score N.E.W.T level exceeds expectations in at least 5 subjects, with transfiguration, charms and potions being highly valued in the application process. In an ironic twist, though, one must score the same in Muggle studies for nearly any other position in the Ministry. Nick recognized that this was in a terrible attempt to make wizards less racist, but it clearly failed most of the time. How could it work when the material for the class was so outdated or wrong that it tended to make Muggles look worse than what wizards thought of them normally? Still, Nick took a break from work or study for a few days after that to relax and recharge his mental batteries. I might be a workaholic, he thought as he sat on the edge of the island with a fishing rod bored out of his mind. It's not that I'm impatient or anything like that, but that I can't help but feel like I am wasting time better spent doing something else, he thought with a sigh. He didn't get to wallow in this strange feeling for long though before Dottie showed up with a panicked expression. Master, the vampire lady has done the unthinkable, it said angrily. Oh? What has she done this time that has you so flustered? Nick asked curiously. She's put out a bounty on Master Nick's life, 2,000 galleons, sir. The house elf said angrily. Nick was taken back by this, as this was a drastic jump in handling the situation on the Vapress's part. Reeling the line in on the rod, Nick hooked the eye of the rod and wound it tight before walking back to the manor. He ignored the squads of Atronachs patrolling the perimeter of the manor and headed to the room he knew had Lucas in it. Need something, boss? The vampire asked curiously when Nick entered the room. The one who turned you has placed a bounty of 2,000 galleons on my life, and I thought you should know, Nick said casually. Nick wasn't bothered by the bounty all that much, but it was slightly irritating. She what? Lucas exclaimed in horror once he heard Nick. Does she even know who you are? Lucas asked in both horror and confusion. Nick couldn't blame him really, as this was the same as trying to assassinate a world leader. The wizarding community in Britain is going to go crazy about this and seek to eliminate the Vampress. It should be noted that nearly every wizard in Britain came from Hogwarts, of which a good third were Ravenclaw. As the last known descendant of Rowena Ravenclaw, attacking him like this was tantamount to slapping all of their faces. Exceeded noble or not, this was a terrible choice to make if you valued your life, which was why Nick wasn't worried. Nick wasn't wrong either, as both the public with ears in the darker side of society and those that lived there were bubbling over at this move. Pure-blood clans were placing bounties of their own on the Vampress, and those living in the dark parts of society that still had some attachment to Hogwarts were planning all sorts of nasty fates for her. The vampire community was also collectively distancing themselves from her, like she might explode at any moment. Chapter 392, Liliana Sturm. How do you plan to handle this, boss? Lucas asked after calming himself down. He might not be the woman's biggest fan after the way she ruined his life, but he didn't want her dead or anything. Well, there is a few ways I can deal with this that each might end in a different manner, and when I say I, what I mean is we. Nick said calmly. Do any of those options not lead to someone dying? Lucas asked, and Nick shrugged. Some do, but that number gets bigger or smaller depending on your thoughts on arranged marriages. He said honestly. I'd rather not if I can help it, but if the woman's sweet enough I think I can work with it. Lucas said honestly. In that case I have a total of 5 plans that involve no one dying in theory. Nick said casually. What do you mean in theory? Lucas asked, confused. Because despite my many skills and gifts I am not in fact a seer, and so can't say for certain that no one would die because of these plans, just that no one should die. Nick explained seriously. Better than nothing I suppose. So what are the plans? Lucas said curiously. Well, first is that you go and command that woman to behave herself, which will expose your new status as a royal vampire to the world. This is actually less than optimal since it will lead to a series of cascading after effects. The next plan is that we secretly approach the royal clan and you marry into it, at which point they will not only be able to solve this peacefully but will also create a tie between me and them through you. Nick said before pausing to let Lucas really think about these options. The third plan involves watching the woman get forced by her parents into rescinding the bounty after the pressure gets too high. There is a chance that she will die though, so do keep that in mind. Fourth is that you marry her and cut out this problem from the roots while also letting the world know you are a royal vampire. This has similar implications as the first option, but there are serious differences based on how the royal clan reacts to the news. The final option is to contact the royal clan and show that we are willing to work with them and ask that they solve this problem peacefully in exchange for some gifts. Personally, I prefer this plan as it will deal with many birds using a single stone. Nick laid it all out in a simplified manner since there was of course a lot of details in each of these. Are there any easier options? Lucas asked, clearly uncomfortable with most of these ones. Well, we could always do nothing about it and see how it plays out. Nick offered with a grin. And how does that turn out, in theory? Lucas asked, and Nick rubbed his chin for a minute in thought. With a rather high body count should things escalate, and peacefully if reason wins out. He answered honestly. How is that better? Lucas asked in horror. You didn't ask for better, just easier. What can be easier than ignoring the problem until it gets too big or goes away on its own? Nick asked rhetorically. What plan has the best outcome that involves someone dying? Lucas asked, but looked like he regretted it immediately. She tragically trips and falls down a flight of stairs and dies. Nick said with a smirk. You'd never get away with a murder like that, they have people that would know if magic was used on her. Lucas said seriously. Who said anything about using magic on her? There are thousands of ways to make coincidences line up favorably without touching a single hair on someone with magic. Nick said ominously. I think we should wait it out first, and if things get violent we go with the final deathless plan. Lucas suggested. Nick shrugged. If that's how you want to handle it, then I see no problems with it. He said before leaving Lucas to his thoughts. Still, thanks to this bounty, Nick now knew exactly who it was that had turned Lucas into a vampire, Liliana Sturm. Nick was actually rather surprised to learn that she was the granddaughter of the Sturm clan's patriarch. Why would a highborn like that be interested in a muggle-born wanderer like Lucas? He wondered before giving up on figuring it out, as women were strange and illogical creatures sometimes. Chapter 393, Mission. With that matter settled, Nick chose to spend the next week working on his Twilight style while cranking out 4 lesser Atronachs per day. Until now Nick had only used the style on the 2 most abundant sources of celestial light, the sun and moon. The style, however, was not limited to these at all and could be used to collect the light of each and every star in the sky above. There was a slight issue with this, however, in the form of the sun and moon's overwhelming presence in the light. Compared to both of those, the light of each of the stars were mere threads the thickness of a hair, which made them very difficult to spot, much less extract. Nick was sure that there was a way to increase the focus on those threads of light to make it easier to extract them, and had chosen to work on that for this next week. He didn't expect to get any real progress made in only a week, but that was fine by him. Strangely though, he actually got a new mission from the system at the end of the week that left him surprised. Mission conditions established. Description: by your actions in taking a vampire as an assistant, you have gotten the attention of several mysterious parties. Clean up your mess. Objectives: solve the vampire situation, earn favor with the royal clan, optional, don't allow Liliana Sturm to die, optional. Rewards: 3x material tickets, the Pale Queen, book, optional, 5x item tickets, optional. Status: incomplete. Ugh. This is going to be a pain to complete, especially that last optional objective, he thought after reading the full mission. It came as no surprise to him that Dottie soon showed up with news about the situation. Apparently there had been an attack on Liliana Sturm in the middle of a heavily populated area that needed the Obliviators in Germany to work overtime to contain. She survived and was unharmed, but rather than rescinding the bounty on him, she actually tripled it. Got to give it to her, she is very stubborn about this if nothing else, he thought as he went to go grab Lucas. The vampire in question was left in a daze after hearing about how the situation had suddenly jumped in severity. Shouldn't she have just gone into hiding after something like this? Lucas asked, confused. She is apparently too stubborn about having you, it seems. It's almost impressive, to be honest. Nick said with a shrug. Looks like we are going to have a conversation with the royal clan, huh? Lucas asked with a sigh. Not quite yet, we need to prepare a gift first, or else we'll look like fools hyping themselves up even if what we say is true. Nick said honestly. Aren't they all like stupid rich? What could we offer that they can't get on their own? Lucas asked with frown. You aren't exactly wrong, but you have forgotten something very important. I alone have 2 crafting methods that can do near miraculous things under the right circumstances. For example, that lovely little ring on your finger. Nick said with a smirk. Lucas's eyes lit up when he heard this, as that was indeed something that no amount of wealth could obtain if Nick didn't want to make an item with those crafting styles. The problem comes in deciding what exactly to give them. Obviously I can't just give them a copy of your ring, since I would need their blood first, not to mention that besides the ability to cast spells as per normal wizarding standards, the rest was pointless to give them. Unfortunately I have no intention of handing over the ability to cast normal spells to the Teeps clan. Feel free to add to this conversation whenever, by the way. Nick said pointedly, and Lucas looked embarrassed. Maybe you can let them access more of their bloodline abilities. Lucas offered, and Nick thought that wasn't actually a bad idea. Even amongst royal vampires there was a hierarchy based on age and the abilities each of them had. By giving a royal vampire even a single extra bloodline ability would shuffle this hierarchy while also strengthening the hold the royal clan had on vampire society. I suppose that is possible, but I'd need a few tests on you to figure it out. Nick said with a grin. Lucas just sighs. Fine, but don't do anything too weird, all right? He asked in a half-begging manner. Not to worry, this will only hurt a little. Nick said before pulling out his wand and dragging Lucas into the realm. Chapter 394, Bloodline Abilities. Lucas was subjected to a series of strange experiments within the realm to figure out exactly how normal bloodline abilities in vampires worked. This meant that Lucas had to be subjected to conditions that caused his original ability of water breathing to activate. Nick accomplished this thanks to the water summoning charm Aquamenti. He summoned a large orb of water and directly tossed Lucas into it. Lucas's bloodline ability worked a bit differently than Nick had assumed, as rather than filtering the oxygen out of the water via magical means, it instead caused a pair of gills to sprout from his neck. So this ability is closer to autonomous selective transfiguration rather than a spell. Interesting. Nick thought as he looked over the results that the realm gave him. He then proceeded to change the fresh water into salt water and marveled as the gills shifted slightly in adjustment. Nick spent the next hour alone switching the parameters of the water to see how the ability would react. High acidity, low acidity, brackish, volcanic, polar, and a few more different possible variations. The ability adapted to each and every type of water flawlessly. Lucas was less fortunate. He had burns, frostbite, and bloodshot eyes from the hostile conditions of the water before Nick finally banished the summoned fluid. He flopped onto the hard ground of the realm limply, but Nick ignored him since he was merely being dramatic. His health was not in any danger at all and was even starting to rapidly improve as his vampiric regeneration came into effect. Still, thanks to these tests, Nick now had a fairly solid understanding of how vampire bloodline abilities worked. There was unfortunately a single problem that he discovered that would prove to be a pain to go around. See, bloodline abilities in vampires were actually limited by the vampire themselves, as it wasn't that they simply didn't have more than 5 abilities at once, but rather that they can't have more than 5. It was a standard matter of pitcher size, which was to say you can only add so much water to a pitcher before it overflowed. In this case, vampires' bodies were the pitcher and 5 abilities was the overflow point. This was because of an inbuilt survival mechanism that made it so they couldn't exceed this cut-off point and were thus stuck at 5 abilities. Nick's solution to this was simply to expand the pitcher so that it could contain more abilities. He did this by actually cutting off the royal's ability to use normal magic in the future entirely. See, the bloodline magic was stored in the blood in the vampire's body, and with the amount of blood in a normal body, the room for them was of course limited. Nick instead chose to create an enchantment that cannibalized the vampire's magical circuits into extra blood veins, thus increasing the room for abilities. He needed to sneak into Hogwarts in order to make the ring to give to the royal clan, since his workshop had all the high-end tools for this, but he vanished before anyone even knew he was there, so it wasn't a problem. The final product was a beautiful silver ring with a simple woven band that had a dragon head design on the top with an artificial ruby in its jaws. The Teeps clan had a thing about dragons thanks to Vladimir Teeps's title of Son of the Dragon. Nick was halfway tempted to have made it a spike with the ruby at the top as a nod to the Impaler, but they hated that title. Nick couldn't really blame them, since the first title was given out of respect and awe, while the second was basically done out of fear and spite for the cruel acts that earned the man that title. Nick was hopeful that he could get an audience with the King of Vampires himself to make this deal, since the man's word was law amongst vampire kind. Unfortunately, that was easier said than done, considering that he had vanished from the public eye after the vampire hunt a century prior that had him targeted by a lot of powerful wizards. Nick knew he was still alive though, as news of him shows up periodically in the vampire community when he solves high-level political arguments amongst the royals. The last time he made an appearance was 5 years ago in a case of a new mithril mine being discovered by 2 royals and them fighting over it, but openly and covertly. His solution was simply to split custody of the profits between both parties based on the seasons. A simple solution, but not one that 2 opposed factions would normally agree to. Chapter 395, Seeking Audience. Contrary to how it may seem, Nick wasn't just giving out valuable gifts left and right without any protections in place. In any of his crafts that held the potential to harm him in some way, he had placed hidden loyalty enchantments that rendered the rest inert should they be used on him. The deal made with Lucas was no different, as he had placed a trap within it in the form of the within reason that meant that so long as he could rationalize an order regardless of how horrible it was, Lucas could not disobey. In this way, betrayal is impossible, since Nick merely needed to command Lucas to return to his work with a bit of rationalization, and he had no choice but to do so. The best part was that this protective mechanism was an incomplete enchantment blended into the others, so there was no way to definitively point out that it was there at all. With the ring done, Nick now needed to figure out how to get a meeting with a royal clan member. It should be mentioned that there are in fact not a lot of royals alive at the moment, since the Teeps clan was very specific about who they turn. That doesn't even take into account the bloody princess that didn't even stay in any one place at once but wandered the world in search of a mate. The bloody princess was the only known natural-born royal vampire whose father was none other than Vladimir Teeps himself, and whose mother was an exceeded noble with 4 bloodline abilities. Unfortunately, the princess had the perfect disguise ability thanks to her mother in the form of Metamorphagus. And unlike Nymphadora Tonks, the princess actually used the gift properly rather than merely assuming different features or turning into other people. No, the princess could freely shapeshift into any non-magical creature and was as a result damn near impossible to track. Contrary to how it may seem, she was actually the single royal that Nick didn't want to meet. Despite having only slightly less authority compared to her father, the princess was known to be horribly temperamental and whimsical, which was about as bad for deals like this as was possible. Do you know who the royal is in charge of the British vampire community, or how to get in contact with them? Nick asked Lucas after returning to the island. Yeah, it's a man by the name of Jessie. From what I understand, he runs the black market in Nocturne Alley, so he can be found there most of the time. Lucas said honestly. Any distinguishing features, or do I need to check every vampire we meet to find him? Nick asked, and Lucas furrowed his brows in deep thought as he tried to remember anything about the vampire in question. He has a tattoo of a dragon on his forehead, but that is his only special feature, I think. Lucas said helplessly. Good enough, I suppose. Let's just hope that he isn't one of those people that use a mask while in the black market. Nick said with a sigh. He didn't waste any time transfiguring himself into an adult, but different than before. This time he turned into a handsome male form with short brown hair and dark eyes. Just for the hell of it, Nick had taken on the form of Voldemort's younger human self thanks to his knowledge of what that looked like. Lucas, on the other hand, merely put on a mask to cover his face and disguise himself. They had Dottie apparate them away from the island before Lucas apparat them to Nocturne Alley. It was clear that the skill was rusty because Nick felt much worse than normal after they landed, but he sucked it down and endured it. They got a few strange looks after they arrived, but ignored them as they made their way to the black market. Nick didn't drop his guard at all, though, as most of those nearby had tainted souls and ill intent. Soon enough they reached the small shack that served as the entrance to the black market. Nick opened the way forward and walked into the bustling bazaar confidently, while Lucas was clearly nervous. Humans were very visual creatures that tended to base their opinions based upon what they can see. From Nick one would see confidence bordering on arrogance and paranoia from how his hand rested on his wand at all times. This would tell those looking for easy prey that he was a bad choice, and that would extend to Lucas as well, since he was clearly Nick's follower. They walked forward slowly as if carefully browsing the various items being sold, but in fact they were scanning each and every forehead they could see. Chapter 396, Royal Meeting. It wasn't until they reached the end of the bazaar that Nick spotted a dark-skinned man with a dragon tattoo on his forehead and the usual red eyes of vampires. The man had a calm look on his face as he surveyed the throngs of people in the bazaar. He stiffened, however, when his eyes fell upon Nick, and Nick smiled and started to walk over to him. It was to my understanding that you were dead, Jessie said with a frown. He certainly is, but I needed a disguise, and the irony was simply far too great to ignore. Nick said in a friendly manner. I see, and I can smell that your companion is one of my kind as well. Wait, what is this? Who are you to dare imitate a royal? Jessie grew angry once he really paid attention to Lucas. Nick could tell that he was about to attack and channeled his spiritual energy into his eyes, causing the vampire to freeze from the pressure on his soul. It is no imitation, but perhaps it would be best if we go to a more private location to speak on it more. Nick offered with the same friendly smile. So be it, but let it be known that we will never stop hunting you if your answer displeases, Jessie said sternly before leading the way into the building at the end of the bazaar. Contrary to its shabby outer appearance, the inside of the building looked like a grand Arabian palace with tall thick support pillars and a golden and jewel-encrusted throne at the end of it. Nick ignored the scantily clad women that littered the place on beds of pillows, looking at him hungrily. Mostly because they were all vampires and he wasn't making him pray to them. Jessie sat upon his throne and stared at them sternly before speaking. I have brought you into my home. The least you can do is discard these disguises so we may speak properly. He spoke calmly but with a clear authority. Lucas looked at Nick, who nodded at him before removing his mask and hood. Jessie had a small change in expression at that, but remained calm before turning his gaze to Nick, who took out his wand and dispelled the transfiguration on him, causing his figure to shrink and shift back to his true appearance. Jessie sighed once Nick returned to normal. I thought as much when I saw who he was. Nicholas Ravenclaw, he said, pointing at Lucas. I take it you can hazard a guess as to why we are here then? Nick asked with a grin. Either a fool or someone confident in their power willingly follows a vampire into their lair. Which are you, I wonder? Jessie asked rhetorically with a smirk of his own. Nick tossed the ring he made to Jessie. A gift before we talk business, one I am sure is more than adequate to interest the royal clan. He said without losing his grin. Jessie turned the ring around with his fingers after catching it and seemed to appreciate the design. He then places it on one of his fingers and immediately shuddered as the enchantment took hold and his magical circuits were cannibalized. Is this what I think it is? Jessie lost all playfulness and went deathly serious when he asked this question. It breaks the limit that you royals have on your bloodline abilities if only by a little. Interested yet? Nick asked with a Cheshire grin. Ha 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 ha. Yes. Let no one dare say that your age hinders you in my presence. What a fine trap you have set for us with a bait we cannot help but want. Jessie roared with laughter and amusement. My proposal is simple really. I will sell equipment made to order to your clan directly and in exchange you will assist me in acquiring materials and other resources at reasonable prices. Of course I will ask for the situation with the Sturm clan be solved peacefully first. Nick spoke casually but firmly. Jessie was still smiling in an amused manner but fell into thought at Nick's words. I can solve the Sturm matter as a gesture of good faith from the royal clan to you but the rest only the king can decide. He eventually stated honestly. Nick nodded. I would have preferred to go to him directly but he isn't exactly an easy person to track down as I am sure you can understand. He said with a shrug. Yes, even now there are those who hunt us for our nature amongst the wizarding community. The king is a prime target for such individuals and thus secludes himself unless necessary to appear. Jessie said calmly. Chapter 397, Hospitality. If it is no trouble perhaps you could stay for a couple days while we wait for His Highness to arrive. Jessie offered in a friendly manner. That's fine, though I do hope to be subjected to these hungry gazes a little less if possible. Makes me slightly nervous you understand. Nick said and Jessie grinned showing off his long canines. You heard him ladies, control yourselves while they are here. He spoke authoritatively and Nick immediately felt the amount of gazes on him drop but not vanish. There was one gaze still on him in the room but it didn't belong to a person but rather a bat hanging from the rafters. Nick's magical senses zeroed in on this creature and he felt a headache develop at what he found. That bat had a dense magical signature that clearly didn't match the body it was in, letting him figure out quickly what or rather who it was. Mina Teeps or the Bloody Princess was apparently spying on Jessie and had definitely heard the entire conversation. Nick made no motions to show that he had discovered her though as he wanted nothing to do with her and refused to initiate contact. Jessie stood up. If you would please follow me I can show you to the guest accommodations. He said before walking to the right side of the throne that held a stone door that looked almost like decoration if it didn't have gaps. The door had a stylized image of a scarab beetle holding up a flaming orb. Nick recognized this as an Egyptian symbol that represented the god of the sun, Ra. I wonder if all mythology was based on the same gods just at different periods. He wondered while trying to figure out whether or not that would even work. Surprisingly enough, the more he thought of the various myths he could recall, he discovered that the gods do indeed seem to share an uncomfortably high amount of similarities. The titles are all mixed up but the general personalities match up fairly well. He thought and decided he should look into some other myths about the end of the gods' reign to see if he could find the seals of Zeus and Hephaestus. Nick chose to ignore Hestia though, since from what he understood of her she won't be taking part in the conflict to come and thus deserved neither his help or harm. Perhaps it was a bit cruel to treat her like that, but Nick didn't have time or resources to waste on neutral parties just to play nice. Anyways, Nick assumed that the reason the door was marked in this manner was because these rooms were meant for those that walked in the sun freely. He was proven correct when Jessie stopped outside of a room that had a skylight that allowed sunlight to enter. The room was just as luxurious as the rest of the building, with 4 large silk-sheeted beds and various expensive-looking decorations. The room had a clear sun theme though, as most everything was a warm golden yellow or orange. This is the sun room of the building that I created specifically for wizards like yourself. I beg your pardon, but what is his status in regards to you? Jessie asked awkwardly after introducing the room. Subordinate or assistant, whichever you prefer. Nick explained honestly. Right, well, your subordinate can take the moon room next to this one since like myself he should be less than favorable to sunlight. Jessie said while pointing at the open room next to the sun room. There is no need for multiple rooms on his account, I solved that problem shortly after he entered my employ. Nick said calmly, and Jessie was taken back but looked intrigued after the information fully registered. Very well then, I will have dinner served at 7 at night and brunch at 11 in the morning. Please feel free to make yourselves comfortable in the meantime. Jessie said with a friendly smile. Nick nodded and walked into the room and scanned it with his magical senses and wasn't surprised to find several spying enchantments all over the room. Jessie left after that and Lucas immediately spoke up. He is a lot nicer than I was expecting. I always assumed that the royals were these old and callous beings that looked down on everyone else. He said while sighing as he sat down on a soft armchair. You don't live long if you can't play nice with others in a social position such as his. Nobody likes a tyrant after all. That said, most of his niceness was fabricated to make us drop our guard, takes a sharp eye to spot, but the signs are all there. Nick said while sitting on another chair casually. Chapter 398, Secret Ambition. Are we in danger? Lucas asked nervously after hearing what Nick said. Not because of him or those under him if at all, we have guessed right at the moment, so I doubt he would do anything untoward. Nick said while taking a book out of his realm. It wasn't anything special, just as book on Atronachs he bought from the system. Contrary to how it may seem, Nick did regularly use the system, however it was for mundane or other things not worth mentioning. One such thing was expanding his knowledge on a topic if there was no readily available source on it. Atronachs fell into this category considering their foreign nature to this world. The book Nick was reading was titled Myriad Elementals by Arvelos Fyr. The entire book was on the studies conducted by a Telvanni wizard into the nature and varieties of Atronachs. It cost Nick 100 points to purchase from the system, but he regained that by making 10 rings of protection, so it was an inconsequential amount to him. At the moment he had over 800,000 points just from the rings of protection and other rings he has made. Once he completed the full 250,000 rings of protection, he will have an excess of 2.5 million points. Thanks to this fact, Nick wasn't really sweating over 100 or so every now and then. And oh, did he have plans for that large sum of points in the future, as he was starting to near a very tasty piece of literature in terms of price. Of Realms and Lords by Zillival Zermex was priced at 1 million points in the system and was written by a Dremora that for some reason decided to document the process of becoming a sort of Daedric Lord by binding a empty realm of oblivion to yourself. Oblivion was a nearly infinite expanse of primordial dimensions that were sort of worlds onto themselves that were known as realms. The largest and thus most complete were bound to the princes that were basically unkillable gods as a result. A not commonly known fact, however, was that other Daedra were able to bind the smaller realms to themselves and become a weaker version of the princes depending on the size and quantity of realms they bound. Nick hadn't noticed it immediately, but due to the use of the Daedric heart during the ritual of nature, his own being was now very similar to a Daedra. A very weak and impure one, but a Daedra nonetheless. And as it just so happened, he had a realm bound to him as its creator that would serve as a perfect starting point to becoming pretty much unkillable. In theory, the only way to kill a realm lord was to destroy their realm before killing them, since Daedra with their own realm can't bind themselves to a prince's realm. If Nick can successfully become a true realm lord, he will have much more assurances about confronting Zeus, since he will be nigh impossible to permanently kill. The best part though was that Arda Milmi was capable of growth, and thus if fed enough will grow so large that it will be able to directly consume the entirety of the earth. At that time Nick will basically be a Daedric prince with an already populated and diverse world under his command. This was his newest ambition and also the stopping point on his path to power. Daedric princes were pretty much the pinnacle of power, and thus becoming one would leave Nick completely satisfied. Anyways, the book on Atronachs covered the properties of the constructs and how to go about changing them to one's will. For flame Atronachs, it was basically just exposing them to different kinds of fire, which Nick already figured out. For storm Atronachs, it was exposing them to various magnetic substances. Frost Atronachs by changing the properties of the water that froze to make up their bodies. Air Atronachs were basically changed by having them consume other Atronachs, thus gaining their properties without losing their original properties. This was all very interesting for Nick, and he had no trouble at all losing himself in the information, letting time pass by quickly. The food served at 7 was a simple meal of lamb chops with asparagus and potatoes. After that, Nick set up a protective ward around himself meant to keep him completely isolated before going to sleep. He didn't know it, but this actually saved him a lot of trouble, as a shadow crept across the floor of the room late into the night completely undetected by Lucas, who was studying nearby. The shadow came into contact with the ward before seeming to reluctantly creep back out of the room. Chapter 399, Spar. Nick woke up nice and early the next day as he usually does and stretched before waving his wand to have his bed made again. "Anything strange happen while I was asleep?" he asked Lucas with a yawn. "Not a peep, boss, nice and calm just like you said it'd be," Lucas said without looking up from his metallurgy book. Nick hummed in response before finding a seat of his own to continue reading his book. At exactly 11, a scantily clad woman brought in a platter of fruit and sweet porridge for brunch. She remained in the room curiously examining Nick as he ate everything that was brought, but he ignored her. Once the now empty platter was removed again, he went back to reading since the information was quite detailed and enriching. Around 3 hours later he closed the book and took out a wooden short sword to practice using it, as Celebrimbor had been instructing him from the mindscape. Elven swordsmanship was less about brute force and more about flow and smooth transitions between strikes. This required correct footwork and control over one's body that made it almost resemble dancing in a way. "I did not know you two studied the blade, not to boast, but I was quite the warrior before I became a vampire," Jessie said with a genuine smile after walking in on Nick practicing. Nick paused after completing his movement and pulled out another wooden sword from the realm and held it out. "Care to shake off that rust?" he offered with a grin. Jessie's smile widened in a predatory manner. "I think I will, thank you," he said, taking the wooden sword. "I admit that I usually wielded a capesh, so the European blade shape feels odd in my hand," he said, giving the blade a few test swings. Nick pulled out his wand and tapped it on the wooden blade, causing it to morph into a strange curved blade with a hook-like tip. Jessie gave the blade a few more swings and grinned widely. "Yes, this is the feeling, how nostalgic," he said happily. Nick tapped his wand against the floor and furniture started to shift away from them to give them room to spar freely. "Your prowess with transfiguration is quite impressive. I dare say that few adult wizards could match it," Jessie complimented honestly. Nick just chuckled. "Shall we start?" he asked while taking a sideways stance with his blade raised at an angle from his right side. "Yes, let's," Jessie said with a grin before dashing forward. Nick was slightly caught off guard as the entire tone and vibe that Jessie gave off in this moment was far different than it was normally. He recovered quickly, however, and narrowed his focus on Jessie while zoning out any outside distractions. The royal coiled his body to the side as he thrust his blade forwards at Nick's chest fluidly. One needed to remember that Jessie was a vampire and as such moved faster and with more power than any human swordsman would. Nick could keep up, however, thanks to both his race's innate attributes as well as the effects of the ritual of reflex. Capesh blades had a rather nasty trick to them, where meeting a thrust from them with an overhead or side strike risked having the blade yanked away from you. Nick, as a smith, knew this and immediately rotated his body to the side while bringing his own blade down at Jessie as the tip of the capesh glided past him harmlessly. Jessie's eyes narrowed as he shifted his weight from behind the thrust to try and recover with a sideways slash. Nick merely redirected his own slash to intercept the other blade while carefully hopping up just before contact was made. Crack! The wood clashed, and like Nick expected, Jessie had used abnormal power behind the strike. Using his position midair and the force of the strike, Nick let Jessie's blow carry him backwards as he readjusted his stance for immediate retaliation after he landed. The moment his foot touched the ground, all the momentum was twisted through his foot up his thigh, abs and shoulders before reaching his arm. Nick's swords whistled as it cut through the air in the vicious yet smooth transition from clash to attack. Clearly this caught Jessie off guard and the strike landed on the upper portion of his right bicep. Both parties immediately disengaged and retreated from the other side in tacit understanding. Should Nick have been wielding a real blade, Jessie would have lost his arm at best and been killed outright at worst. Jessie sighed while rubbing the spot he was struck. It seems I truly have grown rusty if I failed to recognize the nature of your blade like this, he said with disappointment. Chapter 400, The King. I'm told going from a warrior to a politician tends to do that, Nick said reassuringly. Jessie smiled. I thank you for your understanding in this matter. I am embarrassed at my blunder despite my claims, he said apologetically. Nick shook his head. It is clear from the familiarity you have with the weapon that you were not idly boasting. You did make a very large mistake though by relying on your power as a vampire to try and make up for how rusty you were. Take it slow at least until you get the hang of it again, Nick recommended helpfully. I see the Ravenclaw name suits you well as you speak wisely, Jessie complimented. Perhaps. Now come and try again, Nick said as he took his stance again. Jessie nodded and dashed forward once again, though considerably slower this time. He went for an upward slash this time and Nick brought his own blade into a horizontal strike, deflecting the offending blade away from himself. Jessie's hands shifted on the handle and his blade didn't slow down but shifted from upwards to downwards in a tight curve while Nick rotated his hips and met it with another horizontal strike. Crack! 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 The sound of wood striking wood rang out loudly as they danced around each other looking to land even the smallest of blows. Jessie made a few more mistakes that gave Nick the opportunity to land hits, but the royal was rapidly regaining his edge, creating longer and longer periods between each hit. Nick was breathing heavily and had a thick layer of sweat covering him from the intensity of the exercise. Jessie may have been in better shape since as a vampire his stamina was nearly inexhaustible, but unlike Nick he was sporting several new bruises on various parts of his body, with the most notable on the left side of his neck. While I can appreciate the show of skill, I do believe we still have business to discuss, a heavy male voice says after they separated once again. Both of them look towards the source of the voice and Jessie immediately bows deeply. I apologize for not greeting you upon arrival, Your Highness. I had assumed you would not arrive for another day at the earliest, he said, genuinely respectful of this newcomer. The man was not very tall but very stocky, with wide shoulders and strong form along the rest. He had a thin reddish face with a long straight nose, wide cheekbones and piercing red eyes. The man had long black hair and a thick mustache on his upper lip that were both well maintained. The man was by no means ugly, but he had this sort of coldness to him that made him seem unapproachable. Vlad Dracul II, I presume? Nick guessed easily. Indeed I am, Nicholas Iron Ravenclaw, the King of Vampires said with a small smirk. I take it then that you were informed of the situation via whatever method Jessie used to communicate with you then? Nick asked calmly. Oh? And what makes you think I didn't receive the message via owl? Vlad asked while Nick put away the practice swords that were looking very worn. Too easy to track. No one who doesn't want to be found would ever leave such an option viable. Well, at least not the smart ones, and I've been told you are something of a genius, so it stands to reason that neither have you, Nick said calmly. All that from a simple sentence. Yes, I think we will get along splendidly, Vlad said with an approving look. Nick tapped his wand against his chest and all the sweat and dirt on him came off in an orb that he then banished, leaving him clean. Maybe, but we will have to see how this discussion goes first, Nick said seriously. Bah, it is best to keep business and personal matters separate in my experience. A lesson I learned the hard way, as history will attest, Vlad said dismissively. The ring, Jessie, if you would, Vlad added while holding out his hand. Jessie took the ring off without hesitation and shuddered as he lost access to his newest bloodline ability. To be more specific, it was locked away in the new veins as they were disconnected from the rest. The King of Vampires looked the ring over before smiling in an amused manner. A double-edged sword, this enchantment, but it does as advertised, so that is fine, Vlad said while handing the ring back to Jessie. What do you mean, Your Highness? Jessie asked while eyeing the ring suspiciously. The enchantment allows access to the other extra bloodline abilities by converting one's magical circuits into extra veins, thus increasing the blood in the body. Basically, you lose all hope of regaining normal magic in exchange for the ability. Vlad explained casually.
Thanks for listening.